Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It was sometime around late October, about a year and a half ago now, when we pulled into the cemetery. The air had already turned colder than usual for that time of year, and everything felt damp. The grass crunched under the tires as we turned slowly off the old road and into the uneven dirt lot at the front of the cemetery. The fog hadn't rolled in just yet, but you could feel it building somewhere nearby, hanging low in the trees, waiting for the sun to disappear. It was the kind of place that always felt a little wrong, even during the day. But that night was different. Heavier. There were 4 of us. Me, 2 friends who I'd been doing this kind of thing with for a few years, and 1 new guy who tagged along because he'd heard about what we did on weekends and thought it sounded interesting. We weren't professional anything, just people who liked sneaking into places we probably weren't supposed to be. Sometimes it was old barns, sometimes abandoned factories, and sometimes places like this. Cemeteries tucked away from highways, the kind of places where graves sat crooked and headstones flaked away in layers. The kind of place the county had forgotten about, but still mowed once every few months out of some quiet obligation. I'd been to this particular cemetery a lot over the last 2 years. It was a weird spot. Nothing flashy or tragic about it. No local legends, no known hauntings, no historical events that put it on the map. But from the first time we visited, something about it didn't sit right. And not in the way that all cemeteries feel off at night, but in a deeper way. It changed. Not in any dramatic way you could point to, but in subtle ways that you only noticed if you'd been there enough. The main road through the cemetery twisted the same way every time. The gates were rusted open just like always, but details felt off. Like a painting you saw every day. But this time the shadows fell differently, or the colors didn't seem as warm. We parked off to the side, tires sinking into soft ground. The new guy, we started calling him Mr. 500 because of how many photos he took, was already climbing out with his camera slung around his neck. It was a huge camera, one of those high-end ones with a massive lens and multiple attachments. He had a duffel bag full of batteries, filters, and memory cards. We joked about it, but I appreciated the effort. I brought a camera too, a smaller point-and-shoot one that was probably 5 or 6 years old at that point. Mine mostly just stayed in my pocket, unless something interesting happened. We told Mr. 500 he could wander around and take all the pictures he wanted, but to be careful. I don't know why we always said that, because nothing had ever really gone wrong at this place. No close calls with wildlife or squatters, no strange people showing up late at night. Still, we said it out of habit. Then the rest of us headed toward the back of the cemetery, where the trees thinned out and the hill dropped off. There's this spot back there, kind of a natural bowl where the land sinks down into a clearing maybe 50 feet wide. You can't see it from the road, and even from most of the cemetery, it's hidden unless you know exactly where to look. It feels cut off, like something peeled the forest back a long time ago and just left it bare. Every time we came back to the place, it felt different. Not in how it looked, exactly, but in how it felt to stand there. The trees shifted positions in your memory. The brush never grew the same way twice. The slope of the hill seemed steeper some days than others. It was subtle enough that you could tell yourself you were imagining it. But after a dozen visits, you stopped being able to convince yourself. That night, the air in the clearing was colder than the rest of the cemetery. We stood at the edge of the drop, looking out over the clearing, brushing dead leaves off our jackets and lighting up a cigarette or 2 to pass the time. I remember that smell. Wet bark, dry leaves, the sulfur hit of the match. We stood there in silence for a while, just taking in the emptiness below. The trees on the other side were dark silhouettes against the deepening sky. There were no stars yet, but they'd come soon. Mr. 500 was still wandering among the headstones somewhere behind us. Every now and then, the flash of his camera would blink against the night, a white strobe behind the rows of markers. He was serious about it, lining up every shot like he was documenting a crime scene. Then it happened. I was holding my camera, not really doing anything with it, just keeping my hands busy. The lens cap was still on, battery maybe half dead. I wasn't paying attention to much when I saw it, this glowing, amber-colored shape, like a person wrapped in some kind of cloak, drift out from one of the trees across the clearing. I didn't move. I didn't speak. My mind just locked into this moment where nothing else mattered. The figure floated, not walked, not ran, just drifted smoothly from one side of the clearing to the other. There was no sound, no leaves crunching, no wind, just that glow. It wasn't like a flashlight or a lantern. It was a soft, inner light, like the whole shape was lit from inside. It crossed the entire clearing in about 10 seconds, maybe less. Then it vanished into the trees on the other side, as if it had never been there. I blinked, still holding the camera, but I didn't lift it. I didn't even think to. I turned to look at my friend beside me, the one I'd been doing these runs with for a long time. He was staring too, but he looked confused, like what he'd seen hadn't matched what I saw. We didn't say anything. We just stood there, staring at the trees. Later, after we found Mr. 500 again, we talked about it briefly. My buddy described what he saw, and it wasn't the same. He said it looked like static, like a living mass of angry lines twitching and jittering across the clearing. He didn't see any color. No glowing amber. Just this distortion, like a tear in the air itself. The new guy didn't see anything at all. He was too busy trying to get a shot of an old gravestone under a willow tree on the far end of the cemetery. The rest of the night passed in a kind of haze. We didn't pack up and leave immediately. We stayed for maybe another hour. None of us wanted to admit we'd been shaken. We wandered separately for a while, checking out spots we'd seen before, but the clearing sat in the back of our minds like a weight. None of us went back to it that night. I've thought a lot about that moment since then. I've looked up things about visual hallucinations and pressure changes, about how certain atmospheric conditions can trigger strange activity in the brain. I've read stories about electromagnetic fields and how they might affect perception. I've even read about how grief or anxiety can cause shared delusions in groups of people, though none of us had any obvious reason to feel that way that night. But none of that explains why we saw different things. We didn't drink, didn't take anything. We were just there, as we always were. And even now, a year and a half later, I can close my eyes and see that amber light again. I can see it moving in perfect silence, slipping across that clearing like a thought, like something half remembered. And yet the part that sticks with me even more is what came next. Not that night, but a few weeks later. We hadn't gone back to that cemetery since. Something about it just didn't sit right anymore. We kept to more familiar places. But one afternoon I got a call from the guy who saw the static figure. He was at a gas station maybe an hour from the cemetery, somewhere along one of the older highways that cut through the countryside. He sounded off, quiet, like he didn't really know why he was calling. He said he'd been filling up when he saw something across the road. Not the same figure exactly, but something that reminded him of it. A shimmer, a twitch in the air, like heat waves bending on the horizon. He said it was gone the second he blinked, but it felt the same as that night in the clearing. That same charge, that same shift in the air, like everything tilted for just a second. I didn't see it. I wasn't there. But I believed him. I still do. Since then, nothing strange has really happened again. We kept exploring for a while, but eventually life caught up with us. People got jobs, moved away, got busy with other things. The new guy never came on another trip. Mr. 500 sold his camera. I still have mine, sitting in a drawer somewhere. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had taken the photo. If I had pulled that camera up and clicked the shutter at the right second. Would anything have come out? Would I have seen that same glow frozen on the screen? Or would it have been empty, just a patch of trees and grass, no different than any other part of the cemetery? I'll never know. But I still think about that night every time I'm alone in the woods. Every time I pass by a place where the trees seem too still, where the air feels heavier than it should. It changed something in me. Not in a big, dramatic way, but in a quiet, permanent one. And maybe that's the real reason I stopped going back. Not because I was scared, though I was in a way I couldn't explain, but because part of me didn't want to know what else might be out there, waiting just beyond the edge of the trees. Not ghosts, not spirits, just something real enough to see, but too strange to understand. Something that doesn't need to be explained to change you. And that was enough. I remember it clearly because it was midterm week, and I had a psychology exam the next morning. I had been studying all day, barely moving from my desk. My neck was stiff, my shoulders ached, and I had a dull headache behind my eyes. The kind that comes when you're too caffeinated and not hydrated enough. It was past midnight when I finally decided to lie down. Not to sleep, though. I knew I wouldn't be able to. Not yet. My body was in bed, but my mind was still flipping through notes. Diagnostic criteria, case studies, brain chemistry, defense mechanisms. I couldn't stop replaying it all. I thought maybe if I just lay there quietly for a bit, my thoughts would slow down on their own. But they didn't. If anything, they got louder, more anxious. I kept imagining myself blanking out during the exam, forgetting everything, staring down at the paper while time ran out. I had this tight feeling in my chest, like I couldn't fully relax my ribs no matter how deeply I breathed. I kept shifting in bed, eyes open in the dark, watching the faint shadows on the ceiling. I was wired from all the coffee I drank, way too much that day. 3 big mugs, and an energy drink I grabbed during a break. I knew it was stupid, but at the time it felt like I didn't have a choice. I could barely keep up with all my classes, and this exam felt especially important. I had to get through it. I told myself I'd rest after. Just get through this week. That was my mantra. Everything was still normal. I could hear the low hum of my box fan by the window, the quiet, steady drone of the AC unit, and further off, the soft, almost comforting sound of my parents snoring from their bedroom. The hallway light was off, but I knew they were just down the hall, behind their closed door, safe in their bed. It was a typical night, tense but ordinary, and then something changed. It was so sudden, I didn't understand what was happening at first. The ambient noise just cut out. Not completely, but it was like someone turned down the volume of the whole world. The fan, the AC, the snores, all of it faded at once, like they were being swallowed by thick fog. But nothing had changed in the room. My fan was still spinning. I could see the blades in the dim light, feel the air brushing over my skin. But it was as if I was listening to it through earplugs now, like I had been pulled underwater. And then I heard it. Laughter. Not one person. Not even 2. It was a group of women, maybe a dozen or more, all laughing at the same time. Cruel, mocking laughter. Sharp and cold. It wasn't coming from a particular direction. It filled the whole room. It was around me, in me like it was in my head, but also somehow outside of it. They weren't laughing with joy. It was mean laughter. The kind people use when they want you to feel small. It felt like they were laughing at me. Specifically me. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. But those seconds felt long, stretched thin with fear. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just lay there frozen, heart hammering, skin tingling like my body had gone numb. My ears were straining, trying to hear anything else, trying to understand what just happened. But there was nothing. Just that faded white noise again, and my own breath. The fear didn't fade. It got worse, because the silence afterward was just as wrong. I kept thinking maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was so sleep-deprived and stressed that I hallucinated. But I couldn't convince myself. I wasn't dreaming. I hadn't even fallen asleep yet. I was fully awake. I was sure of it. My mind had been racing all night. I hadn't even started to drift off. I kept trying to explain it away, but I couldn't, and the fear wouldn't let go. I felt watched. Not just creeped out. Not just spooked. Watched. I kept glancing around the room, hoping to see nothing. I didn't dare get out of bed, but staying there felt unbearable too. My eyes kept darting toward the door, the corners of the room, the ceiling. I felt like something was standing just behind my vision, just out of reach. The air felt heavier. Not hot, just thick, like something invisible was pressing down on me. Eventually, I broke. I flung off the covers and bolted to my parents' room. My whole body was shaking. I didn't say anything at first. I just knocked hard on the door, then opened it and stepped inside like I was a kid again. My mom sat up, surprised, and without thinking I climbed into their bed and curled up next to her. I didn't care how it looked. I didn't care about being an adult or being rational. I just needed to be close to someone. They didn't argue. My dad got up and went to sleep in my bed. I felt bad about that later. But at the time, I couldn't be alone. I just couldn't. Even then, I didn't sleep much. I closed my eyes and tried to pretend everything was fine, but I kept hearing faint whispers. Not words, just soft breathy sounds near my ear. I couldn't tell if they were real or not, and that made it worse. I kept jerking awake, heart pounding, eyes wide in the dark. Every sound in the room felt sharper, more suspicious. I was so scared my body wouldn't fully relax. I made it through the night, barely. In the morning, I felt like I had been hit by a truck. My head throbbed, my stomach hurt, and I couldn't eat. I went to class and sat through the exam in a daze. I barely remember filling in the answers. I kept thinking about the laughter, the whispering, the silence, trying to piece it together. Later that day, something bad happened to my father. I won't go into detail because it's still hard to talk about, but it was serious. The timing of it shook me. He had been fine the night before, the same night I had that experience. And then that morning, it was like a switch flipped. Everything changed. The thing is, my family has a history with the occult. Not me personally, not my parents, but further out. Some of our relatives are into things they shouldn't be. Things my mom always warned us about. She would tell stories when I was younger, about curses, about rituals, about people in the family who held grudges so deep they'd turn to anything for revenge. I never believed it. I thought it was superstition, folklore, maybe exaggerations born out of fear and old family drama. But after that night, and what happened the next day, I couldn't write it off anymore. It felt targeted. It felt intentional. Like someone had sent something to mock me, to enjoy my fear, to prepare me for the damage that would follow. I started thinking back on all the stories I'd dismissed, about relatives who saw things they shouldn't have, about illnesses and accidents that came out of nowhere, about strange animals showing up outside people's homes, about dreams that weren't dreams, about unexplained sounds, people dying too young, people going missing. At the time, I thought it was all coincidence and imagination, but now I wasn't so sure. After that night, I became more aware. Things I used to ignore started to stand out. Lights flickering where they shouldn't. Pets acting strange. That feeling of being watched when no one is there. Waking up with a start for no reason. It didn't happen all the time, but when it did, it was like a knot tightened in my chest. Like something was brushing against the edges of my world. It wasn't ghosts. It wasn't some fairy tale horror movie thing. It felt colder than that. Less theatrical. Just wrong. Unnatural in a way I couldn't explain, but couldn't ignore. A lot of the time, it was just a feeling. A sense that I wasn't alone, even when I was. That I was being noticed, singled out. I started sleeping with a nightlight. I started checking my room before bed. I stopped drinking coffee late in the day because I couldn't afford another sleepless night like that. But even with all those precautions, the fear lingered. It was like a stain, something I couldn't fully scrub out. Some nights were worse than others. I could usually get through them, but every now and then, I'd hear that laughter again. Just for a second. Just long enough to know it wasn't gone. And the worst part is, I still don't know what they want. Whoever they are. I've tried to ignore it, tried to rationalize it. But deep down, I think it was a warning. Or maybe just a taste of what they could do if they wanted to. And what happened to my dad, that was their proof. Their message. Now I take it seriously. I don't joke about the occult anymore. I listen when my aunts talk. I keep salt by the windows. I burn sage, even if I'm not sure it works. I stay away from certain people in the family. I don't open letters from them. I block their numbers. I protect myself however I can, because I know something came into my room that night. I didn't see it, but I felt it. I heard it, and I'll never forget it. Not ever. It was one of those days where the air felt heavy, like something was off, but you couldn't quite put your finger on it. My producer, Dan, and I had been working on a podcast that dove into paranormal stories. Nothing too outlandish, just strange occurrences that couldn't easily be explained away. We had all kinds of listeners, from people who were utterly skeptical to those who firmly believed in every ghost, creature, or urban legend. And that was part of the appeal. We tried to stay grounded in reality, but sometimes, no matter how hard we tried to rationalize things, there were some stories that simply didn't add up. The woman we were scheduled to interview had caught our attention a few weeks earlier. She'd once worked as a nanny, and during her time in that role, she'd witnessed strange things happening in the household, things that no one could explain. Her name was Claire, and she had been through a lot, according to the brief we received. Her story seemed to be centered around one child she had cared for, a child whose family had been involved in some pretty strange circumstances. She was reluctant to talk at first, but after we shared our plans for the podcast and explained we had a fair bit of evidence to back our investigation, she agreed to sit down with us. Dan, as usual, was skeptical. I think he'd always been that way, a bit of a show-me-the-proof type. It wasn't that he didn't believe in the possibility of weird stuff happening, but he liked to have things explained by science, by facts. He was the first to roll his eyes when we mentioned anything even remotely supernatural. I didn't mind the back and forth. It kept the show grounded, and I had my own healthy skepticism. But something about this story was pulling at me. There were things that didn't sit right, and I thought maybe we could uncover some answers. The day of the interview, we arrived at Claire's apartment. It was in a quiet part of the city, tucked away in an older building with thin walls and creaky floors. We'd spoken to Claire on the phone earlier, and she seemed fine, though there was something in her voice that made me uneasy. She was anxious, but then again, who wouldn't be when talking about something so heavy? When we got there, we knocked, and knocked, and knocked some more. There was no answer. Dan suggested we just leave. I could feel my own impatience creeping up. We had an appointment, and I didn't want to let this slip away. The whole situation had a weird vibe to it, sure, but that's exactly why we were here. I looked at the door again. It was slightly ajar. The thought crossed my mind to just leave, but it wasn't like me to walk away from something. I was committed to getting to the truth, whatever it might be. So, I decided to try the door. At first, Dan hesitated, glancing at me like I'd lost my mind. "Don't do it," he said, his voice tense. But I didn't listen. I pushed the door open. It creaked, the sound stretching out in the empty hallway. We stepped inside, and immediately, I felt the shift in the air. Something wasn't right. The apartment was unusually still, but not in a peaceful way. More like the stillness of a room that had been untouched for too long. Dust hung in the air, as if it hadn't been disturbed for ages. The furniture, though modest, was turned in odd directions, like someone had rushed through the space in a panic. I could see the outline of a few things in the living room that had clearly been overturned: a small coffee table, a lamp that had been knocked over. The whole atmosphere felt wrong. We called out to Claire, but there was no response. I don't know what I expected. Maybe the sound of a voice, maybe footsteps, something that would explain the strange vibe I was feeling. But nothing came. That's when I noticed the smell. It wasn't strong at first, just a faint sour odor that seemed to come from the other room. But as I walked further in, it grew thicker, like something had been left to rot. I remember turning to Dan and asking him if he thought we should leave now. But before he could answer, something caught my eye. There, hanging from the ceiling fan, was Claire. At first, I didn't fully process what I was looking at. My brain didn't want to make sense of it. Her body was suspended by a thick extension cord tied around her neck, her limbs dangling limp. She was pale, almost ghostly, her face contorted in a way that made my stomach flip. The room, I realized, was covered in blood. It was splattered across the walls, so much of it that I thought the entire apartment had been dipped in red paint. There were handprints smeared across the walls, as if someone had tried to push themselves away from something, maybe in their last moments. The blood had dried, turning a dark brownish color that contrasted sharply against the pale yellow walls. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, even though I wanted to. But it wasn't just the blood. It was the buzzing. At first, I didn't hear it clearly. It was just a background noise, something I assumed was coming from an appliance or something nearby. But when I stopped and listened, I realized what it was: hundreds, maybe thousands of flies. The buzzing was deafening, and when I looked up, I saw them. Thick clouds of them, all around Claire's body, all over the ceiling, crawling over the walls. The sight was horrific, their tiny bodies flitting through the air, feeding on the blood. Dan, who had been frozen in shock just behind me, finally snapped out of it and rushed to the door. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at Claire. It was like I was trapped in the moment, unable to process what I was seeing. A part of me wanted to reach out, to do something, but another part of me, more primal, I think, knew there was nothing I could do. I remember the feeling of my heart pounding in my chest, the pit in my stomach growing larger and larger. Everything about the scene was wrong. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of death and decay. The flies didn't stop. They just kept moving, swarming over the body, feeding, as if everything in the room had been reduced to a mere object to feed on. Dan had already called the police. I could hear his voice shaking as he spoke, trying to explain what we had found. My mind raced, but there was no getting away from the reality of it. There was no explaining it away. There was no mystery left, only horror. I could barely hold it together as I stood there, taking in the sight of Claire's body, the blood on the walls, the flies that seemed to never stop buzzing. When the authorities arrived, I was in a daze. They did their thing, cordoning off the apartment, examining the scene. They didn't say much to us, which I understood. They were just trying to process what had happened themselves. They asked if we had been in contact with Claire recently, if we knew anything about her, but by then, I could barely even speak. The next few hours felt like they stretched into an eternity. We gave our statements to the police, though I could barely remember what I said. I kept seeing her hanging there, her lifeless eyes staring at nothing. I couldn't shake it. I couldn't forget the blood or the buzzing. That night, when I finally made it home, I tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come. I couldn't escape the images in my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the apartment, saw Claire's body hanging there, saw the blood on the walls. The buzzing of the flies, those damn flies, stuck with me too. It was as if the noise had been embedded in my brain, playing on an endless loop. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. The insomnia started that night. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing down on me. It's been months since that day, but the images are still fresh, like they happened yesterday. And the buzzing, God, the buzzing never stops. It haunts me in the quiet moments when I'm alone, when my mind has nowhere to hide. It's like a phantom sound, always just out of reach, always there. I still can't shake the feeling that I made a terrible mistake walking into that apartment. Maybe it's just survivor's guilt, maybe it's the weight of what I saw, but I can't help but think, if we had just left when we couldn't reach her, if we had just listened to our instincts, maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe I wouldn't be living with this constant terror. Dan never talks about it much, but I can see the toll it's taken on him, too. We never did get to interview Claire, but maybe we learned more than we ever should have. Maybe some stories are better left untold, hidden behind locked doors. I still can't sleep, and every night I hear the buzzing. We were in the middle of a normal dinner shift when it happened, the kind of dinner shift where everyone is half staring at their food, just waiting for it to be over so we could get back to something that didn't involve standing in line, chewing through tasteless meat, or talking about the next patrol. The smell of stale bread mixed with the grease from the kitchen hung in the air. It was the kind of smell that soaked into everything, making you just a little bit more tired every time you breathed it in. I was sitting at a long metal table, shoveling down my meal like everyone else, when I saw him walk in. The officer. He had that look on his face, the kind that made you freeze even before he opened his mouth. Captain Marshall. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a strict air about him that made everyone straighten up even when he wasn't around. He wasn't a man you wanted to disappoint. He didn't look around for too long, didn't waste time on the usual pleasantries. Instead, he just turned on his heel and headed toward our bunk area, making his way past the rows of chairs and tables. A couple of guys noticed him, but no one said anything. When Captain Marshall moved, people didn't talk unless they were spoken to, and even then, you spoke only when you had to. A few minutes later, we heard the loud thudding of boots as he came back through the door. His face was unreadable, but his voice had that sharp edge to it that made all the noise in the room drop to a whisper. Who left a sandwich in their locker? He said it as though he was asking a simple question, but the silence that followed made it clear we all knew this wasn't something trivial. There was a moment of stunned quiet as the whole room turned to look at him. For a second, it felt like everyone was holding their breath, trying to figure out who the hell would be stupid enough to leave food in the locker. And not just any food, a sandwich. I mean, we all knew the rules. No food in the bunk. No exceptions. It wasn't like we had access to food most of the time anyway. When we did, we ate it on the spot. The thing was, the lockers were supposed to be empty. They were meant to be a place for storing your uniform and gear. Not your snacks, not your lunch, and definitely not some sandwich wrapped in plastic. But there it was, sitting innocently in one of the lockers, as though it was the most normal thing in the world. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. Guys looked around nervously, but no one wanted to fess up. You could see it in their eyes. They were all trying to act like they didn't know anything about it. But the problem was we all knew what this meant. If someone had been caught with food in their locker, it wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was punishment, and harsh punishment at that. They'd put the whole barracks on extra PT, and no one wanted to be the one who caused that kind of trouble. When the officers weren't around, we did what we could to get by, and that sometimes meant sneaking snacks into our lockers. It was never talked about openly, but it was something we all understood. But leaving a sandwich like that out in the open, that was a new level of stupid. So naturally, as the seconds ticked by and no one stepped forward to claim it, it became clear that someone would have to pay the price. After a long silence, one of the guys from the back of the room spoke up. He had that smirk on his face, the one that always made him look like he was about to do something ridiculous. I could already tell he was ready to stir the pot. "I guess if no one's owning up to it," he said, looking around at the group, "it must have been a ghost." At first, I thought he was just joking, trying to break the tension. But he went on. "Yeah, a ghost. Maybe one that likes sandwiches. If there's a ghost in the bunk, maybe it'll put a sandwich in my locker too." He laughed it off, and the rest of the room followed suit. They weren't laughing because it was funny. They were laughing because it was better than standing there in the silence, waiting to get punished. Marshall didn't find it funny, though. His face stayed stone cold as he turned to the group. "Fine," he said. "You can all keep pretending it's a joke, but whoever did this is going to regret it. And I mean that." With that, he walked out of the room, and the chatter picked up again, but there was still a tension hanging in the air. People looked at each other, half expecting the room to explode into accusations or laughter, but nothing really happened. For a minute, it felt like everything was just normal again. We didn't talk about the sandwich after that. No one wanted to be the one to remind everyone of the elephant in the room, and the officer's warning still lingered in the air. When dinner ended, we all filed out of the mess hall and into our bunk area, but as we passed the lockers, I noticed something strange. Everyone had their lockers locked up. They all had that look of wariness, like everyone knew something might happen, but no one wanted to admit it. I didn't give it much thought until we were all back in the bunk after last parade. That's when it really hit the fan. As soon as we stepped into the room, one of the guys from the back of the room, the one who had made the ghost joke, made a show of walking up to his locker. Everyone followed him with their eyes, curious to see if something was really going to happen, if the ghost would actually do something weird. He reached out, turned the combination lock on his locker, and slowly opened the door. The entire room went silent. Sitting right there, on the bottom shelf of his locker, was the damn sandwich. Everyone froze. I don't think anyone knew what to say. The look on his face went from cocky confidence to sheer confusion in seconds. He stood there, staring at the sandwich, his mouth hanging open. He looked back at the rest of us, and for a moment, no one knew what to say. It was impossible. There was no way someone had snuck in and put that sandwich in his locker. We were all in the same room. The doors had been locked, the windows were secured, and no one had left the room after last parade. No one had been anywhere near the lockers, except for Marshall when he did his sweep. But there it was, right in front of us. The room broke into chaos after that. Guys started shouting, some of them looking for an explanation, while others just stood there in disbelief. A few of the more logical ones started looking around for any kind of trick. Maybe someone had hidden it in there before last parade, but it didn't make sense. There was no way anyone could have done it without the rest of us noticing. The guy whose locker it was looked at it for a moment longer, then shoved it to the back of the locker and slammed the door shut. But it didn't matter. The mood had shifted completely. The feeling of unease that hung over the room was almost suffocating now. It wasn't just about the sandwich anymore. It was about how something had happened, something that no one could explain. And it was all in front of us, impossible to ignore. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, everyone wondering what the hell had just happened. But we all knew one thing for sure. No one was going to admit to putting the sandwich there. It was too weird, too impossible. We were all left standing there, looking at each other, unsure of what came next. The rest of the night was quiet, as if everyone was afraid to say anything else, afraid to make it worse. And in the end, nothing else happened. There were no more sandwiches, no more mysterious events. But we never really spoke about it again, not in the same way. And from that point on, there was a certain tension that never really left our bunk. Something had shifted that night, and no one ever quite figured out what. But I can tell you this, it wasn't just a sandwich. It was the feeling that sometimes things happen for no reason, and you just have to accept it. I haven't thought about this story in years, not really. It's one of those memories that sort of lurks in the back of your mind, just out of reach, until something random brings it rushing back. I think I was around 10 or 11 when it happened. Somewhere in that awkward stage between being a little kid and starting to feel like you know stuff about the world, even when you don't. It was summer. Hot, sticky, and long days filled with softball games, bike rides, and melting popsicles. That particular day, I had a game with my church league. We weren't great, not terrible either, just a bunch of kids and their parents trying to have a good time and stay active over the break. We were at the usual park, one of those places with a big grassy field cut into multiple diamonds, dusty bases, and aluminum bleachers that would fry the backs of your legs if you sat on them too long. Our team wore these deep blue shirts with white lettering, and I still remember how the material clung to me with sweat, how the air smelled like cut grass and sunscreen, and how excited I was that I might actually get a hit that day. I was 3 batters away from being up, so I wandered a bit down the third base line, not too far, just far enough to swing my bat a few times and stretch my arms. The rest of the team was huddled in the dugout or sitting in the grass with their gloves, chatting and cheering. That's when this man walked up to me. I didn't know him, had never seen him before, but I didn't think anything of it at the time. He looked like someone's dad or uncle, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s. Average height, thinning brown hair, some graying at the temples. He wore a light plaid shirt tucked into faded jeans and brown boots, the kind of guy you'd expect to see fixing something around the house or standing in line at the hardware store. He had sunglasses on, one of those trucker hats with a logo I didn't recognize, and a short, trimmed beard. He smiled a little, not a big grin, just enough to seem friendly. I wasn't scared. It was broad daylight. There were parents on the bleachers, coaches on the field, other kids all around. It felt like the safest place in the world. He asked me if I was playing today. I told him yeah. He asked what league this was, if it was church or school, stuff like that. I answered without really thinking, just normal small talk, you know? He seemed interested, but not weirdly so. Looking back, maybe he was just waiting for the right moment. Then he said he needed some help. Told me he locked his keys in his truck, and his dog was stuck inside. He made it sound urgent, but not dramatic. Just a guy in a bit of a bind on a hot day. He said the truck was parked over on the side of the lot, that it had one of those little sliding windows in the back of the cab. Too small for a grown man to fit through, but probably just right for a kid like me. He asked if I could help him out real quick. Said it would take just a minute. He even motioned with his hand like it was just over there, no big deal. At first, I didn't think anything of it. My brain didn't throw up any red flags. I'd been taught not to talk to strangers, sure, but I guess in that moment it didn't register. We were at a church league game. There were people everywhere. I wasn't in an alley or some dark parking lot. It didn't feel like a dangerous situation, and he didn't look scary. He didn't grab me or whisper or do anything that felt threatening. He just seemed like a regular guy who needed help. I swear, to this day, I was a breath away from saying yes. My mouth was open. I had already taken a small step in the direction he pointed. It gives me chills now thinking about how close I came. But just then, the kid at bat got a hit. A decent one, too, and the coach started calling people to get ready. I realized I was now 2 batters away, what they call in the hole. I looked back at the man and told him I was almost up, but that I was sure someone else would help him. He nodded, kind of shrugged, and said something like, "No worries," and walked off toward the parking lot. I watched him go for a second, then turned back to my game. I didn't think about it again until after we lost and were packing up. I was talking to my parents about the game, and I kind of casually mentioned it. Like, oh yeah, some guy locked his keys in his truck and needed help getting his dog out. At first, they didn't react. But then my mom froze mid-sentence, and my dad turned to look at me sharply. They started asking questions. Lots of them. What did he look like? What was he wearing? Which direction did he come from? Which direction did he leave? Did I see the truck? Did I see a dog? At the time, I didn't understand why they got so serious so fast. My dad pulled out his phone and made a call. I know now he was calling the police. I tried to backtrack, to explain that it wasn't a big deal, that nothing happened. But I could see the shift in them, the way they looked at each other, the way they double-checked that I hadn't actually followed the guy or gone anywhere alone. I got a lecture on not talking to strangers, on always coming to them if someone asked me for help, on how even nice-looking people could have bad intentions. At the time, I mostly just felt embarrassed, like I'd done something dumb. The weight of what almost happened didn't hit me, not until years later. I'm 26 now, and a few years ago, when I was back home visiting, the topic somehow came up again. We were talking about old memories, childhood stuff, the kind of nostalgic conversations you have with your parents when you're older, and all the small things suddenly seem important. My mom brought it up first. "Do you remember that guy at your softball game?" I said, yeah, kind of. She told me they had kept an eye out in the news afterward, just in case. And not too long after, there was a report about a man matching the description I gave. Same area, same general appearance. Arrested for attempted kidnapping. Apparently, he'd been trying to lure kids away from parks using similar stories. Lost dog, locked keys, the kind of thing that sounds just believable enough. One kid actually went with him, but started screaming before they got far, and someone intervened. Hearing that hit me like a ton of bricks. For the first time, I really sat with the reality of what almost happened. How close I came. I keep replaying that moment in my head sometimes. That 1 second before I said I had to bat. That one tiny choice that made all the difference. If the kid before me hadn't gotten a hit. If I'd been a little more eager to help. If he'd approached me just 5 minutes earlier when I wasn't thinking about the game. It haunts me. And what's even scarier is how normal it all felt. How safe I thought I was. There's this false comfort we get from being in familiar places, surrounded by familiar people. We think that predators lurk in the shadows, in dark alleyways, or behind bushes. But sometimes they stroll up in the sunshine, wearing a friendly face and a ball cap. I started looking into stories like mine. Turns out, it's a common tactic. They appeal to your empathy, make you feel like a hero. Just help me real quick, they say. And for a kid who wants to be helpful, who wants to be seen as capable, it's an easy trap. I was lucky. That's the only reason I'm here to write this down. Not smart, not better, just lucky. Pure chance. That experience changed something in me. I don't mean in a dramatic, movie-like way. I didn't become paranoid or shut down emotionally, but I did become more cautious, more aware of how quickly things can turn. When I see kids wandering off at parks now, when I notice someone lingering too long near a group of children, there's this part of me that goes on alert. Not because I'm trying to be a hero, but because I remember. I remember how easy it was to be almost fooled. How easy it would have been to become a statistic. My parents did everything right. They talked to us about strangers, about safety. But that moment taught me that even when kids know the rules, they're still kids. They don't always connect the dots. They think in pieces. They feel invincible, especially in places that feel safe. And the people who want to hurt them know that. I think a lot about that man, about what he wanted to do, about where he is now. Maybe he's still locked up. Maybe he's out, changed his name, moved states. Maybe he did it again. I don't know. I'll probably never know. But I can still see his face sometimes. That slight smile, that calm voice, that harmless question. I wonder how many other kids he tried with. How many said yes. It's strange to carry a memory like that. Something that didn't happen, but almost did. It's like a shadow of a life that could have been. And I'm so grateful every day that I never had to find out where that road led. That a random hit in a little league game changed everything. So yeah, I haven't thought about that story in a long time. But it's always there, just below the surface. A reminder, a warning. And maybe, by writing it down, it can be a warning for someone else too. Because the world isn't always what it seems. And sometimes, the scariest things happen in the most ordinary places. I lived in a small 2-bedroom house with my mom and sister when I was about 13 years old. It wasn't much, but it was home, and we had moved there not long before. The house was old, a little worn out in places, but still, it was ours. The walls were a drab off-white, and everything was basic, kind of how you'd expect in a small place in a neighborhood in Cincinnati, Ohio. One day, my mom let me paint my room. She told me to pick any color I wanted. And I think I was trying to make it feel more like my own space, something that wasn't just another room in a house that wasn't mine in the first place. I decided on gray. I thought it would look sleek, modern, and give the room a little character. In hindsight, it looked like I was living inside a steel box. Everything was gray. The bed, the curtains, the walls, it all blended together. But at the time, I thought it looked cool. We used this special kind of paint, the one with the glaze on it, so you could wipe it off easily. I guess it was supposed to be practical, but I don't think it was really intended for something like what happened to me. The first few nights after the paint was dry, it didn't seem like anything was off. But that all changed one night when my sister and I were lying in bed. We had our own rooms, but we were both in my room that night, probably because we'd stayed up too late watching TV. The night was quiet, and the only light in the room came from the street lamp outside, filtering through the thin curtains. I remember it so clearly, how the room felt. It was cold, but not too cold, just enough to make the air feel like it had a chill to it. The shadows on the walls stretched long because of the street lamp, making everything in the room look strangely unfamiliar. My sister had already dozed off next to me, and I was just staring at the ceiling, letting my mind wander when I saw it. At first, it was like a strange shadow, shifting in the corner of my vision. It was hard to place, just a blur of gray where the wall met the ceiling, but I could swear it wasn't just a shadow. My eyes kept drifting back to it, and I felt that feeling you get when you know something's wrong but can't figure out what exactly it is. You know that kind of unease? Like when you walk into a room and suddenly feel cold for no reason, or you sense someone's watching you, but when you turn around, no one's there. That's what it was like. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was just tired. But when I opened them again, I saw it more clearly, a face. Not like some vague, imagined thing, but a face. Clear as day. A face staring right at me. It had eyes, a nose, and a mouth, all etched into the wall like it had always been there. The face was pale, like it was carved out of the gray paint, but its features were dark, as if shadowed in some way. It didn't move, but it didn't need to. It felt like it was watching me, and I couldn't take my eyes off it. It wasn't the face of a person I knew, or even one I recognized, but there it was, staring right at me from the wall. I'm not sure how long I stared at it. My heart was racing, my skin crawling, but all I could do was look at it, transfixed, frozen in place. I could feel my breath catching in my throat, but I couldn't scream. My mind was going 1,000,000 miles a minute, trying to make sense of it. How could a face just appear like that? Finally, I snapped out of it. My sister was still lying next to me, snoring lightly. I didn't want to wake her. She was a heavy sleeper, and I didn't want her to think I was overreacting. But I couldn't stop staring at the face on the wall. I turned my head away for a second, thinking maybe if I just looked away, it would disappear. But when I turned back, it was still there, as clear as ever. That's when I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed. I didn't even mean to, but the scream just erupted from me, and it felt like it was the only thing that could get rid of the face. I screamed so loud, it probably echoed through the whole house. My sister shot up, blinking sleepily, and I could tell she had no idea what was going on. I don't know if she didn't see it or if she didn't care, but I knew something was wrong, and I couldn't just lay there and ignore it. My mom came rushing into the room, looking half asleep, but the panic in my voice made her spring into action. I pointed to the wall, but when she looked at it, I saw the expression on her face change. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she was just as freaked out as I was. She rushed over to the wall, grabbing a cloth, and started scrubbing at the paint, like somehow, if she just wiped hard enough, the face would disappear. But it wouldn't. It didn't even lighten up. The face stayed there, perfectly clear, as if mocking her, mocking us. I don't remember how long we stood there, my mom scrubbing and me just staring, unable to pull my eyes away from it. It wasn't like a shadow or a trick of the light. It was solid, as if it had been painted there, but none of us had painted it. The face was right in front of me, and nothing we did could make it go away. Eventually, my mom gave up, looking defeated. She sighed and told me it was probably just something weird with the paint. Maybe the glaze had reacted in some strange way, making it look like a face. But I didn't believe that. I couldn't. Not after seeing it with my own eyes. My mind was spinning. I wanted to stay with my mom, to sleep in her bed, but I couldn't bring myself to be near that face. That night, after my mom had given up, I just grabbed a can of paint and painted over the face. I couldn't stand looking at it anymore. The gray of the paint covered it up, but even as I painted over it, I felt like it was still there, hiding just underneath the surface. I didn't care if it didn't make sense, I just needed it gone. The act of painting over it gave me a strange sense of relief, but also a deep sense of dread. I knew that something wasn't right. That wasn't the only strange thing that happened in that house, either. In the weeks after that, I started to notice other things. Small things, like lights flickering or doors creaking open on their own. Sometimes, I'd hear footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, or feel like I was being watched. I could never shake the feeling of something being wrong in that house. It felt like it wasn't just us living there, like something else was there too. Something old, something that had been there long before we had moved in. One night, I was in the basement, looking for something my mom had asked me to find. The basement was cold, damp, and smelled like mildew, but it was mostly just an unfinished space with boxes and old furniture. I was about to head back upstairs when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. Standing at the top of the basement stairs was a figure. It wasn't clear at first, but then I could make out the outline of a person, dressed in a long, old-fashioned nightgown. The figure didn't move, just stood there staring down at me. It wasn't like a shadow or some blurry shape, it was solid. I froze, my heart pounding, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just turned and ran back up the stairs as fast as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't tell anyone about that, though. I didn't want to sound crazy. But from then on, I hated going into the basement, and I hated being in that house after dark. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, like I was being smothered by whatever was living there with us. Eventually, we moved out. My mom found a new place, and we left that house behind. We didn't stay there long enough for me to get used to it, but I was glad to be out of there. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest the moment we walked out the door for the last time. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened in that house. I don't believe in ghosts, and I don't think there was anything supernatural going on. But something about that house, about that room, and the face on the wall felt wrong. It was like something in the house had been disturbed, something that wasn't meant to be noticed. Whatever it was, I was glad to leave it behind. It was June of 2013, a warm summer evening when my best friend and I set out for what was supposed to be an adventurous bike trip along a 60-mile trail. The idea was simple enough: enjoy the outdoors, escape the grind of daily life, and challenge ourselves on a long, rewarding journey. We had been planning this for weeks, and finally, the day arrived. Packed with gear, water, snacks, and our bikes, we were ready to take on the trail. The route wasn't entirely new to us. We'd ridden portions of it before, but we'd never taken on such a long stretch in one go. The plan was to ride about 30 or 40 miles out, where we knew a man who used to work with us at the local store had a cabin. He had offered to let us stay in one of the 2 cabins he rented out. We figured it would be a great way to break up the ride and get some rest before heading back. The first leg of the trip went smoothly. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot, with a light breeze to keep us cool as we pedaled our way through the winding paths of the trail. We passed by dense trees, the occasional creek, and fields stretching out into the distance. It felt freeing. The type of freedom you only get when you're surrounded by nature, and the only thing you hear is the sound of your own breath and the wheels rolling along the dirt. We arrived at the cabin just as the sun was starting to dip low on the horizon. The cabin was quaint, nothing extravagant but comfortable, with a cozy feel to it. It had electricity, heating, and even AC, which felt like a blessing as the humidity in the air was rising. The man, Rick, who we knew through work, greeted us warmly. His dog, Scout, a large, friendly lab mix, came bounding over to greet us too. We exchanged pleasantries, and Rick invited us over to his house just down the road for dinner. The dinner was nice. Rick and his wife were welcoming, and the food was simple but good. We ate, talked, and played some cards after. It was the kind of evening you'd expect from a small-town get-together, casual, relaxed, with no expectations. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was dark. The storm had started to roll in as we entered the cabin and settled into the living room. We didn't think much of it at first. Thunderstorms in the summer weren't uncommon, and we were just glad to be inside. The power went out shortly after we got comfortable. The air conditioner hummed for a few seconds, then shut off, followed by the quiet flicker of the lights. The storm outside raged, the rain hammering against the windows, and the wind howling in a way that made the cabin creak. We tried to pass the time by talking, but the atmosphere felt off, like the storm was somehow heavier. There was a palpable tension in the air, like something was brewing not just outside, but inside as well. That's when Scout, the dog, began acting strange. At first, it was just subtle. He'd wander around the room, his paws padding softly across the hardwood floor, then stop and stare at the corner of the room. It was a little weird, but nothing to be concerned about. Dogs do that sometimes, right? But then, he would raise his head and look up again, his eyes fixed on the same corner. His body language shifted from relaxed to tense, like he was sensing something we couldn't. This continued for a few minutes. I tried to brush it off as nothing, but it started to feel like there was something more to it. Then my friend, who had been sitting quietly next to me, suddenly tensed up. She looked at me with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I froze. I hadn't heard anything specific, but the way she was looking at me sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just fear, it was pure, unfiltered dread. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely above a murmur. The speaker, she said, her eyes glued to the corner of the room. It just moved. I blinked, confused. The speakers above the TV were just a few feet away, mounted to the wall. I hadn't noticed anything unusual about them, but now that she mentioned it, I could see it too. The speaker closest to the corner of the room had shifted. It wasn't a dramatic move, just a couple of inches, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I looked at Scout. His gaze hadn't wavered. He was still locked onto the corner of the room. Okay, that's weird, I muttered, standing up slowly. My eyes scanned the room. It was dark, too dark. The storm outside had knocked out the lights, and now only the faint glow from the TV and the occasional lightning flash illuminated the cabin. My friend and I both stood in uneasy silence, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. I swear, I heard something upstairs. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was the storm, but it sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking around. But that was impossible. The cabin was supposed to be empty, and no one else was supposed to be here. My stomach dropped, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I wanted to dismiss it, but the thought of someone being upstairs, it was too unsettling to ignore. We didn't say anything at first. We didn't need to. The fear was already palpable, thick in the air between us. The more I tried to rationalize it, the worse it felt. I couldn't bring myself to look at the windows. There was something about the darkness outside that felt suffocating. It wasn't just a storm anymore. Something felt wrong, fundamentally wrong, in a way I couldn't explain. I glanced at my friend. She was holding her phone, staring at the screen like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. She didn't even seem to notice when I grabbed my jacket and moved toward the door. Let's go outside, I said quietly, my voice shaky. She nodded quickly, standing up, and we both made our way to the door, stepping outside into the thick, humid air. The storm was still howling, the rain coming down in sheets, but the open space felt like a relief. At least we weren't trapped inside anymore. We stood on the front porch, trying to catch our breath, our minds racing, but our bodies still on edge. The fear hadn't subsided, and it was only getting worse the longer we stood there in silence. That's when my friend's phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen, her eyes narrowing as she read whatever notification had popped up. "You've got a Facebook notification," she said, holding up the phone. I wasn't paying attention to her words, though. I was too caught up in the fear gnawing at my insides, the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. I looked at her, confused. I didn't have Facebook, never had. I had a flip phone at the time. So, why would I be getting notifications? I'd always been the kind of person who stayed off social media. Still, I tried to dismiss the nagging feeling and focus on what she was showing me. "It says you posted a photo," she continued, her voice suddenly dropping to a whisper. "On your timeline." I shook my head. I didn't post anything. My phone doesn't even have the ability to do that. I didn't even bring my phone inside the cabin. She opened Facebook and tapped on the notification. My stomach dropped as I saw it. There on her screen was a photo of me and two friends. It wasn't recent. The photo was from at least a month ago. I stared at it, trying to piece together why I was seeing this. I hadn't posted anything, and my friends weren't with us right now. It was just me and her. Then my heart froze. The caption read, "We never sleep." I didn't understand. Why would my Facebook, my account, send out a post I didn't make? How was that even possible? And why would the caption say something so disturbing? I'd never written anything like that. I don't understand," I whispered. "Why would you get a notification about a photo I posted a month ago? And why isn't it even tagged right? You're not in the photo." My friend didn't know either. We stared at the screen in silence, but the sense of dread was growing unbearable. Something wasn't right. Something far beyond our understanding was happening, and I didn't know how to stop it. We went back inside eventually. The dog, Scout, had stopped following us. I don't know where he went, but he didn't stay by our side like he usually did. The entire cabin felt wrong. The walls felt closer, the air heavier. We made our way upstairs, barricading ourselves in the bedroom. It felt like the only safe place in the entire cabin. We pushed a dresser in front of the door, as if that could keep whatever was lurking outside at bay. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. The rest of the night was a blur. We barely slept, if we slept at all. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every flash of lightning set us on edge. We didn't leave the room. The dog didn't come back. The storm eventually passed, but the fear never did. When the sun came up the next morning, we left as quickly as we could. We packed our things in silence, barely speaking to each other. But one thing was clear. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us that night, something that had been in the cabin with us. To this day, I still don't know what happened. Why did I get that Facebook notification? Why was the photo from a month ago? And why was the caption so eerie, so unsettling? Was someone messing with us, or was it something more? I don't know. But that night, in that cabin, I learned that some things are better left unexplained. Some things don't have answers. Some things just stay with you, gnawing at the edges of your mind, forever unanswered. And I'll never forget the feeling of Scout staring into the corner of that room. I was at my girlfriend's apartment, just a regular Friday night. She lived on the first floor of a small, nondescript building in the city, with two of our friends hanging out and drinking before we made our way downtown. The apartment was a cozy studio, just big enough for the two of us. We were drinking, chatting, and just unwinding, the usual weekend vibe. It was calm, nothing unusual. After a few beers, we decided to head out onto the private porch to smoke. It wasn't accessible directly from the apartment, but the door was right next to the main one. So we stepped outside, and I felt the cool night air hit me, a welcome break from the stuffiness of the apartment. We all lit up, passing around cigarettes and talking about random stuff. It was nice. But then one of my friends, his voice a little quieter than usual, asked, "Who else is coming over?" I glanced over to the window. Normally, the blinds were drawn, but now there was a faint glow from inside the apartment. I turned to look, and I froze. There, in the studio, standing near the counter, was a man. His appearance hit me instantly. He looked rough, like someone who'd been up for days, his hair matted and unkempt. He had that wild, cracked-out look, his body too thin, like he hadn't eaten in days. My heart raced. I knew what he was doing there immediately. The first thing that caught my eye was the way he was staring at the set of new cooking knives I had just hung up on the wall. They were sharp, brand new, just the kind of thing a person like that would go for. Without thinking, adrenaline took over. My legs moved before my brain could catch up. I bolted for the door, not even saying a word to my friends. I don't even remember hearing them behind me. I reached the apartment door, kicked it open, and stormed in. The guy saw me and froze, his eyes wide for a split second before he turned and sprinted for the closet. I ran after him, almost tripping over my own feet as I lunged at the door. I yanked it open, ready to grab him, but instead of a normal reaction, he screamed. It wasn't just a shout, it was like a banshee, this blood-curdling, inhuman shriek that made my heart skip a beat. I could have sworn my blood ran cold. My instincts kicked in again, and I just grabbed him. The guy was trying to scramble away, but I tackled him, pinning him down to the floor. He struggled beneath me, his body trembling, and I could feel how scrawny he was. He was weaker than I expected, but something was off. I could feel his hands reaching towards something behind him. When I glanced down, I saw what it was. In his hand was a medium-sized flathead screwdriver, the kind with a long, thin metal shaft and a sharp edge. It was clearly meant to be used as a weapon. I couldn't believe it. My heart was pounding in my chest. If I hadn't reacted as fast as I did, that thing could have easily been in my stomach or my side. The guy had clearly been planning something. I still wish I had done more. I should have punched him, beaten him senseless. But something about the whole situation stopped me. Maybe it was the shock of the whole thing happening so fast, or maybe it was the realization that I had stopped him before anything worse could happen. But I didn't. I just held him down, my weight on top of him, my arms locked around his, making sure he couldn't get free. He kept squirming, his breathing ragged, and I could see the fear in his eyes. It didn't make me feel better. It didn't give me any satisfaction. It just made me want to get him out of my apartment as quickly as possible. My friend barged in a few seconds later, and together we managed to drag him out and onto the porch. I didn't let him go, not until the cops arrived. He kept muttering under his breath, making strange, almost nonsensical comments. But it didn't matter. I had him. He wasn't getting away. When the police finally showed up, they took over. They told me that he was a known local, someone who had a history of breaking and entering. They said I did the right thing, keeping him pinned down. But I still couldn't shake the feeling of wanting to have done more, wanting to have really taught him a lesson. He didn't say anything when they cuffed him, just stared at the ground like he knew his time had come. I didn't sleep much that night. The whole thing kept playing on a loop in my head. That scream, the way he tried to hide, the way I felt when I saw the knife he'd picked up. It was all too real, too close. I didn't even feel safe in my own apartment for a while, even though everything was fine. But I couldn't shake the image of his eyes staring at the knives, his fingers inching toward them like it was his last hope. I wish I had beaten him up. I wish I had made him regret even stepping foot inside my girlfriend's apartment. But in the end, the police did their job, and that's all I could do. I was thankful no one was hurt, but I couldn't help feeling like it could have been so much worse. 2 weeks later, I found out the guy had been caught trying to break into someone else's apartment just a few blocks down. They caught him the same way, but this time, they weren't as lucky. He was carrying a knife, and the cops weren't as careful as I was. They took him in, but not without a struggle. I still think about that night sometimes. The rush of adrenaline, the way everything happened so fast. And I'll never forget the look in his eyes when I tackled him, like he knew it was over. That was the night I realized how fragile everything really is, how quickly it can all turn upside down. I never thought it would happen to me, but it did, and I don't ever want to go through it again. The second story takes place a couple of years ago, in November. It was cold, real cold, when I decided to take a trip to an old asylum in Connecticut. The kind of place where you'd expect to find decay and overgrowth, the kind of place that's perfect for exploring. There's something about abandoned buildings, the way they hold memories and secrets, that makes them irresistible. I didn't want to go with anyone, though. I wanted to go alone. I was looking forward to the solitude, to just wandering the halls and letting the silence settle around me. It felt like the kind of place where you could really disconnect from the world. I didn't bring much with me, just my flashlight and a small pack with some wine for when I was done. It was early in the afternoon when I first got there, the air biting at my skin. The place had been abandoned for years, and the outside was overgrown with vines and moss, giving it this eerie, forgotten look. The wind howled through the trees, and I could already feel the isolation settling in around me. But it felt good, in a way. Like I was part of something that was slipping away, that had been forgotten by everyone except those like me, who craved the feeling of the unknown. I was careful as I moved through the building. It had that old, musty smell, like old books, mildew, and dust. The floors creaked under my weight, but I moved slowly, not wanting to disturb anything too much. I was exploring, not vandalizing. I didn't want to ruin the place. I just wanted to see it, to witness what time and neglect had done to it. Everything seemed fine at first. It was just me in the shadows, the dust motes dancing in the dim light from my flashlight. The walls were peeling, the windows cracked, and the rooms were filled with forgotten memories of what the asylum had once been. But then I started hearing something. At first, it was faint, just a quick shuffle of footsteps, maybe. I stopped and listened, but the sound faded. I shrugged it off, assuming it was my imagination. I kept going, but then it happened again. This time, it was louder, closer. It was a running sound, like something was chasing me down the hallway. I froze. It sounded like it was coming from behind me, but I didn't dare turn around. I called out a friendly hello, just to see if someone else was there. Maybe a group of explorers, or even some kids messing around. But nothing. No response. Just silence, an oppressive, all-encompassing silence. Then, after a few moments, I heard it again, louder this time, almost too close. It wasn't the sound of children either. It was something different, something off. I couldn't explain it, but it sounded like a grown man laughing. It wasn't a fun laugh, not at all. It was unsettling, the kind of laugh that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The kind of laugh you hear from someone who's lost touch with reality. I stopped walking. I listened carefully, trying to pinpoint the direction. But there was nothing. Just silence again. That damn laugh kept echoing in my head, and I found myself gripping my flashlight tighter, my hands sweaty despite the cold. I kept moving, hoping I could shake off the feeling of being watched. I didn't want to get scared, not in a place like this. I had to keep going, but as I moved into another room, my flashlight swept across a crack in the wall, and I saw something that made my stomach drop. There, through the crack, was an eyeball. A human eyeball, bloodshot and blinking, staring right at me. It was like it was waiting for me to notice, and once I did, it didn't look away. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the eye, which seemed to grow even more intense, like it was squinting in the light. And then that laugh again. This time, it was right next to me. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and bolted. I ran as fast as I could, not caring about the rooms I was passing or the walls I was crashing into. All I could think about was getting out of there, back to the world I knew, the world where I wasn't being stalked by something I couldn't see. I ran all the way down to the entrance, the sounds of my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. When I finally burst out into the daylight, I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I don't know what happened that day, what I saw, or who, if anyone, was following me. But the only thing I do know is that I'll never go back to that place. Some places are better left forgotten, left in the dark. I wasn't sure if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. But whatever it was, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I was 18 when it happened, just out of high school, living in a small town in East Texas where everybody knew each other, or at least acted like they did. The kind of place where people waved when they passed you on the road, where the only real hangout was the Dairy Queen, and on a Friday night, the whole town seemed to roll up and go quiet by 10. My parents had raised me strict, curfews, manners, always know your surroundings. But like any teenager, I pushed the boundaries sometimes, especially once I got a car. It was an old, boxy Ford sedan, blue with a rusted bumper and bench seats that squeaked when you turned. Not the fastest thing on the road, but it was mine, and it gave me a kind of freedom I hadn't had before. That night, I'd gone to a party in the next town over. Just a few people I knew from school, and some others I didn't. It wasn't anything wild. A little music, beer in red plastic cups, cheap chips in bowls. I stayed longer than I planned. It was already well past 2 when I finally stepped outside. The summer air was heavy and sticky, and the roads were dark in that particular way that only exists in rural places. No streetlights, just patches of moonlight breaking through the clouds, a long ribbon of blacktop stretching through trees and fields. That kind of dark that makes you feel like the whole world is asleep and you're the only person awake. I got in the car, rolled down the windows to let some of the heat out, and started driving. I had about a 30-minute drive back to my house, most of it on back highways that cut through stretches of pine woods and farmland. At that hour, there weren't many cars out, maybe the occasional 18-wheeler, but mostly it was just me and the road. I was tired, but still alert, tapping the steering wheel to the crackling music from the radio, something twangy and old that faded in and out depending on how close I was to a signal. I don't remember when I first noticed the truck. It might have been a few miles out of town. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw 2 headlights, bright and too close. At first, I figured he was just in a hurry to get somewhere, but even when I sped up a little, he didn't pass. He just stayed there, tight on my bumper. No other cars on the road. No turns. Just him and me. I felt a little ripple of unease, the kind that crawls up your spine before your brain catches up to why. I slowed down a bit to let him pass, but he didn't. He matched me. Stayed close. Too close. I tapped my brakes, just a little, to see if he'd back off. Instead, he stayed right on me, his headlights flaring in my mirrors. That was when my stomach dropped. Something about it didn't feel right. Maybe it was the time of night. Maybe it was the way he hovered there like he wasn't in any rush to go anywhere at all. Maybe it was just gut instinct. But it felt wrong. I'd been followed before. Usually it was just someone too lazy to pass, or a guy trying to flirt in that dumb, slow-roll way. This wasn't that. I kept driving, trying to stay calm. The highway was long and empty, bordered by woods and ditches on either side. No gas stations, no open stores, not even a house with a porch light on. I started planning, running through my options. I could pull off at a rest stop, but there wasn't one for miles. I could try to find a police station, but that was all the way back in the town I'd just left. Home was closer, but I didn't want him knowing where I lived. The last thing I wanted was to pull into my driveway and have him follow me in. That image alone made my hands shake on the steering wheel. I took the exit toward my town. He did too. I told myself he might just be headed the same way. Maybe he lived out here. Maybe he was just a local. But every time I turned, he turned too. The roads were getting smaller now, more familiar. I passed the old gas station that had been closed for years, the bait shop with the leaning sign, the dirt trail that led to the river. Still, he stayed behind me. I started to sweat, not from the heat, but from that prickling kind of fear that makes your skin cold and hot at the same time. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I kept glancing at the mirrors, hoping maybe he'd finally turn off. But he didn't. I was about a mile from home when I made the decision. I wasn't going to let him follow me all the way. There was a stretch of road near my house, just before the turnoff. It curved around a stand of tall trees and widened a bit, just enough room to pull over without sliding into the ditch. I'd passed it 1,000 times before. That night, it looked like my only chance. I slowed down. He didn't. As I pulled over, his headlights filled my rearview mirror again. I shifted into park, locked the doors with a hard push of the button, and kept my foot hovering over the gas. My hands were slippery on the wheel. I stared straight ahead, heart pounding, trying not to let my fear get away from me. I could feel him still behind me, idling. Then I heard it. His engine cut off. The silence was worse than the sound. I couldn't hear anything else, not crickets, not wind, nothing. Just my own breath and the faint creak of my car cooling in the night air. Then came the sound of a car door slamming shut. It echoed too loud in the stillness. I couldn't see him clearly, just his silhouette in the side mirror, moving slowly toward me. His steps were deliberate, slow. I saw a glint of something in his hand. It caught the moonlight just enough. Long, thin. I couldn't tell if it was a knife, but it might as well have been. I didn't wait to find out. As his hand reached toward my door handle, I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun for a second before they caught. Gravel kicked up behind me as the car lurched forward. I didn't look back. I just drove, tires screeching as I took the curve harder than I should have. I didn't care. I didn't even feel the wheel fighting me. I just drove. I turned down a side road I didn't usually take. It looped through some back fields and came out near the train tracks, about 2 miles from my place. I figured if he was following me again, he wouldn't guess which direction I'd gone. I didn't see any headlights behind me. I kept going anyway. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I killed the lights and sat in the car for a while, just breathing, listening, waiting to see if anything moved out there. But everything was still, silent, like nothing had happened. The house was dark, my parents asleep inside, completely unaware. I didn't sleep that night. I locked every door, pulled the blinds shut, and kept watch by the front window until the sky started to pale with morning light. My car sat in the driveway like nothing had happened, but I kept seeing his shadow in the mirror. The shape of him reaching out, the glint of whatever he had in his hand. The way he never said a word, just moved slow and certain, like he'd done it before. I never saw that truck again. Never got a license plate, never found out who he was or what he wanted. I didn't tell my parents either. I didn't want them worrying, or worse, taking my keys away. I just kept it to myself for a long time, but it stuck with me. Years later, I told the story to my own kid. She was about 16 then, just starting to go out more with her friends, starting to drive at night on the same roads I had. I didn't tell her to scare her, not really. But I wanted her to understand that it's not always about being polite or giving people the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes you have to trust that gut feeling when something feels wrong. Sometimes you don't get a second chance to make the right decision. I think it stuck with her too. I still don't know what would have happened if I hadn't driven off when I did. If I'd frozen up, or if my car had stalled, or if I hadn't locked the doors. I think about that sometimes. Wonder how many other girls he might have followed. Wonder if he ever got the chance to finish what he started. But I made it home that night. And that's something. Back when I was in high school and through most of college, me and a bunch of friends got hooked on weird NJ stuff. If you're not from New Jersey or haven't heard of it, there's this whole culture around urban legends, weird places, creepy stories, and half-documented history tucked away in the woods, down dead-end roads, or hidden in plain sight across the state. It's not just ghost stories either. A lot of it is just strange places, abandoned buildings, forgotten factories, and places with stories that don't quite add up. There are books and websites and forums dedicated to it. We got obsessed. Every weekend or so, when we had time and someone had gas money, we'd pick a spot from one of the books or something we saw online, load up our cars, and drive out there in the middle of the night. It was dumb sometimes, dangerous a few times, but it gave us this thrill that felt better than anything else. One night still sticks with me more than the rest, though. It's one we still talk about sometimes when we're together, and it's the only time we all came away from one of these little adventures genuinely freaked out, not just spooked by some old insulation blowing in the wind or a raccoon jumping out of a dumpster. It was early fall, The kind of night where the air has that wet, heavy feel, but it's not really cold yet. Earlier in the day, it had rained like hell. Torrential stuff. It let up sometime in the late afternoon, but there was flash flooding in parts of town, and even a few reports on the news of roads being washed out in the low-lying spots. Normally, that would have been a red flag for us, but I guess we were just too bored or too stubborn. Someone, probably Kyle, said we should go check out this old oil refinery down in an industrial part of the state. He had read something about it online, not much of a backstory, just that it was completely abandoned, fenced off, no power, no security, just this massive rotting shell of a place left to the elements. The pictures he showed us looked like scenes out of a video game. Metal stairs twisting into the sky, rust-eaten tanks, graffiti over every flat surface. It was a maze of metal and concrete, half drowned in puddles and grime. We had 2 cars that night. Kyle had his Blazer, which was already beat to hell but could go through anything. I had my little sedan, an older Corolla, low to the ground and not built for anything more intense than a pothole. There were about 8 or 9 of us all together, split between the 2 cars. We left around 11 p.m., taking back roads most of the way to avoid drawing attention. By the time we got near the refinery, it was probably around midnight. The place was exactly as it looked online. Huge, silent, and dead. We pulled off into this broken lot surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence that someone had clearly cut years ago, just wide enough to squeeze a car through. Kyle went first in the Blazer, easing through the opening like he'd done it a dozen times before. I followed, a little slower, hearing the metal scrape along the sides of my car. Once inside, the road became less of a road and more like broken concrete slabs with weeds growing out of the cracks. Puddles were everywhere, and not the shallow kind. These were deep, murky, and spread out across entire patches of ground like small lakes. We inched forward toward the main building, a massive dark silhouette against the sky. No lights anywhere, just the moon, which wasn't doing us many favors. Then I saw it, the biggest puddle I'd ever seen in my life that wasn't part of a lake. It was directly in our path, maybe 30 feet across, but I couldn't tell how deep it was. It had rained so much earlier, the whole area was probably half flooded. Kyle's Blazer didn't stop. He gunned it, splashing straight through, the water rising up to cover his wheels completely. I watched his tail lights bounce as he pushed through and eventually rolled to a stop on the other side. I hesitated. I didn't want to flood my engine or get stuck. I could already hear my friends in the back seat calling me soft, telling me to just go. I backed up a bit to get a little momentum and floored it. The water slammed against the sides of my car like a wall, and for a second I thought we weren't going to make it, but we came out the other side, tires sloshing, and coasted up next to the Blazer. We parked, engines still running for a few seconds before shutting them off. Everyone climbed out, some with flashlights, others using their phone lights. We stood there for a moment, looking up at the main structure, this towering grid of pipes, tanks, stairs, and catwalks. The air smelled like rust, oil, and wet concrete. It was quiet in that kind of way where you can hear your own breathing, even with a group of people around you. There was a kind of hum in the air, not from machines, but from the space itself. Something about the size of the place, or maybe just how quiet everything was, made your ears pick up on tiny sounds, water dripping, metal creaking somewhere deep inside. We stayed there for maybe an hour. We explored the ground level, poked around the base of the main building, stayed out of the more dangerous-looking spots. There was standing water everywhere, some places shin-deep. We didn't try going up any of the metal stairs. They looked too rusted to be safe. At one point, I found an old office room with broken glass and soggy papers all over the floor. Everything smelled like mildew and rot. Some idiot carved a pentagram into the wall with something. Typical. We didn't see anything especially weird, just the usual stuff you find in places like that. Trash, graffiti. The sense that people had come through before us and either trashed the place or tried to mark it as theirs in some way. After a while, we all started to feel the cold set in. Our shoes were soaked, our jeans heavy with water. The thrill was wearing off, replaced by the creeping discomfort of being wet, cold, and tired. We decided to head out. That's when things got strange. We walked back toward the cars. Mine and Kyle's were parked side by side when we got there, only they weren't. Both cars were now facing the opposite direction, like completely turned around. Nose to tail, facing back toward the entrance. At first, I thought I was just misremembering, like maybe in the dark I'd gotten turned around. But then I saw the skid marks in the gravel and puddles where we had floored it through earlier, leading directly to the spot where we had parked. There was no mistaking it. We had both pulled up facing the main building. Now both vehicles were rotated 180 degrees, as if someone had physically moved them, turned them around, and parked them neatly where they now sat. Everyone started to panic a little, in that stupid, half-laughing, half-terrified way. We all had our keys on us. No one stayed behind. There was no one else around. Even if someone had snuck in and done it as a prank, there wasn't enough time. We were never out of earshot long enough for someone to start two separate cars, move them, and shut them off without being noticed. My keys were in my pocket the entire time, zipped in. I checked anyway, still there. No signs of forced entry. Same with Kyle. It didn't make any sense. Then we realized something else. The giant puddle we'd driven through earlier? Gone. Completely. The ground was wet, sure, but the standing water was nowhere in sight. We walked back down the path a bit to where it had been, and it was just gone. The water that had been knee-deep just an hour earlier had either drained completely or had never been there at all. But we had driven through it. We had felt the water hit the undercarriage. My car still smelled like wet asphalt, and the wheel wells were caked in mud. It had been there. That's when I felt that first real prickle of unease. Not fear exactly, but something colder, something more hollow. We all just stood there for a few seconds, unsure of what to say. It was one of those moments where everyone's thinking the same thing, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud, because once you say it, it becomes real. We got in the cars quickly. No one really talked much on the way back. I remember driving in silence, the only sound the wet hum of the tires on the road. Every now and then someone would say something like, "That was messed up," but it would just fade into silence again. The adrenaline had turned into this low, vibrating sense of unease that didn't go away even when we made it back to someone's driveway and parked. Later, we tried to come up with explanations. Maybe someone had been there. Maybe some workers or squatters had a spare key or hot-wired the cars. Maybe the puddle had drained through some kind of grate we hadn't seen. Maybe we were just overtired, misremembering things. But none of it lined up. No one had been left alone. None of us had seen or heard anything. No tools, no broken locks, nothing missing from the cars. Just two vehicles turned around with no explanation, and a giant body of water that disappeared without a trace. We never went back to that refinery again. After that, we kept doing weird NJ stuff, but never with the same reckless energy. Something about that night shook us in a way none of us wanted to admit. I still don't have a satisfying explanation for what happened, but I've stopped trying to force one. Not everything has to be paranormal to be unsettling. Sometimes just not knowing is enough to leave a mark. And that's what stuck with me the most. Not the fear, not the mystery, but that empty, unsettled feeling of something being wrong in a way you can't name. Something too ordinary to be supernatural, but too precise to be chance. That's what gets under your skin. We still tell that story sometimes. Always the same way. We drove in, we parked facing the building, and when we came back, the cars were turned around and the water was gone. No lights, no noises, no people, just us and the feeling that something had been there and decided to let us leave. It was a warm afternoon in early fall, one of those days where the wind never really stops moving out here on the high plains. It's never quiet, not really. Even when there's no one around, the breeze keeps everything alive, the leaves, the grass, the rattling of old aluminum gates, wind chimes 2 houses over. I was home alone that day, sitting on the couch with the TV on in the background, more for the noise than anything else. I remember I had a glass of water in my hand, condensation dripping onto my shirt, and my legs kicked up on the coffee table. The screen door was shut. The big wooden door was open to let in the fresh air. That door doesn't lock, and it never really closes right unless you slam it. I'd meant to fix it a dozen times, but like a lot of things, I hadn't gotten around to it. My dog, a mid-sized mutt with a lot of attitude and more energy than sense, was lying by the door. She's got this one squirrel she hates with everything she has. This mangy-looking thing with a torn ear and a twitchy tail that loves to come around and taunt her. It runs the same route every time, hopping the fence, darting across the yard, and heading straight for the big tree at the corner of our property line. She loses her mind every time it shows up. And every time, if that wooden door isn't shut all the way, she bolts. That's exactly what happened. One second I was half dozing, and the next there was a loud bang as she shoved the door open and tore across the porch, barking her head off. I jumped up, spilling water down my shirt, cursing and stumbling after her. I wasn't even mad. This was just routine at this point. I was more worried she'd run into the street or get someone else's dog stirred up. But as soon as I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something was different. The barking wasn't the usual high-pitched frenzy she had for the squirrel. This was deeper, more intense. It had this kind of edge to it that made my stomach turn. I followed the sound across the yard toward the big tree. She was down there, standing at the base, looking up, absolutely losing her mind. I jogged over, thinking I'd see that damn squirrel halfway up the trunk, chattering and taunting like it always did. But the moment I looked up, my heart stopped cold. It wasn't a squirrel, not even close. There was a bear in the tree. Not a huge one, not some monster you see in national parks, but still a solid, thick-bodied black bear, up in the crook of the branches, maybe 15 feet off the ground. Its fur was dark brown, almost black, and it was watching my dog with wide, scared eyes. It was holding onto the branches like it had just scrambled up there in a panic. The sight of it didn't even process fully at first. My mind was trying to make it into something else. I blinked, took a step back, stared, and blinked again. But it didn't change. It was really there. I could hear my heart in my ears. My legs went numb for a second. This was in the middle of town, not on the edge, not near the hills or open fields. This was dead center, where you could hear kids playing on bikes and smell neighbors grilling burgers 3 houses down. There weren't supposed to be bears here, but that didn't matter right then. What mattered was my dumb dog still barking at the base of the tree, like she had any idea what she was up against. The bear shifted on the branches, clearly agitated, scared, and stressed. Its ears flicked back and forth, and it kept looking down at her, and then scanning the area around it. I knew if I didn't get her away soon, this could go really bad really fast. So I started creeping forward, real slow. I kept my arms low, my breathing even, and tried to talk myself down in my own head. Just get the dog. Don't make noise. Don't run. Don't spook the bear. I was within reach, just a foot or so from her. I bent down slowly, fingers brushing her collar, ready to yank her back and get out of there. That's when the bear jumped. It happened so fast I didn't have time to do anything but flinch. The branches cracked and snapped like gunfire, and then there was a huge thud as it hit the ground. It was so close, I swear I felt the brush of its fur against my arm. My whole body jolted back, stumbling into the dirt. The dog darted sideways, barking even louder now, like this was all some big game. The bear didn't stop to look at me. It bolted, straight toward our backyard, crashing through the low brush and kicking up dirt and leaves as it ran. My dog chased after it like she was a wolf in a cartoon, nipping at its heels, completely unaware that one swipe could end her life. I scrambled up and tore after them, still in disbelief that this was real life. Now, our backyard was mostly fenced in. We'd been meaning to finish the job that afternoon, just a few more panels left to nail into place. As luck would have it, or bad luck really. Those unfinished gaps were now the bear's only way out, and it couldn't figure it out. I rounded the side of the house just in time to see chaos. The bear was running in wide, frantic loops around the yard, brushing against the fence as it tried to find an exit. My dog was still barking, still chasing, never actually getting close enough to bite, but keeping the pressure on. It was like a scene from a movie, except I could feel every step pounding in my chest, and my mouth was dry and my hands were shaking. I started yelling, trying to call her back, trying to snap her out of it, but it was no use. She wasn't listening. She was in her zone, all instincts and noise. The bear kept spinning around, changing directions, climbing halfway up the fence and falling back down. It was breathing heavy now, froth gathering around its mouth, its eyes wide with panic. I was terrified that any second it was going to stop running and turn around. Just one paw, one strike. That would be it for her. That would be it for me if I got too close. I tried cutting off her path, stepping between her and the bear at one point, but she just darted around me. The bear kept moving, but it was getting more and more erratic. I could see the way it stumbled on one turn, the way it hesitated near the corner, unsure which way to go. It was getting tired. That was the worst part. I didn't have a plan. I just kept trying to run after her, to grab her collar, to stop her somehow, anything. My legs felt like jelly. My hands were slick with sweat. My voice was raw from yelling. Then something clicked. The bear made a final mad dash for the far corner of the yard, the one where the fence wasn't finished. It shoved its bulk through the opening, knocking over the last upright post that had been leaning there, and disappeared into the alley behind the house. My dog went right after it. I bolted after them, just in time to see the bear galloping full speed down the alleyway, heading toward the open fields behind town. My dog was still chasing it, but starting to slow. The adrenaline was wearing off for both of us. I whistled, screamed her name, stomped the ground. Finally, she stopped. She turned back, panting, looking as proud as I've ever seen her. I collapsed on the grass near the alley, knees shaking, arms heavy, lungs on fire. She trotted back, tail high, like she'd just saved the world. I grabbed her collar and held onto it like it was a lifeline. That's when I noticed the people. I looked up and realized there were at least 4 or 5 trucks parked along the road out front. Neighbors were standing in their yards, on their porches, some with phones out, others just pointing. Someone must have seen the whole thing, or at least parts of it. I felt like I'd just come out of a war zone, completely out of sync with the normal world around me. I led her back to the porch, finally shutting the wooden door properly behind us, locking it this time, even though the lock barely worked. I sat down on the floor just inside, arms around her neck, trying to catch my breath. She licked my face like nothing had happened. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for my hands to stop shaking, for my breathing to slow. I kept replaying the moment the bear landed, the feeling of its fur brushing my skin, the weight of it hitting the ground, the chaos that followed. I couldn't believe it had happened. Not here. Not in our town. Not in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. Animal control showed up later, along with a couple of deputies. I gave my statement, still kind of stunned. They said the bear had probably wandered into town looking for food. Maybe it followed a creek bed or got turned around in the fields. They weren't sure, but they said it wasn't the first time, just rare. Really rare. They'd be on the lookout, but it was probably long gone by now. I was just glad my dog was okay. Glad I was okay. Things could have gone 100 different ways, and none of them were good. If the bear had decided to stand its ground, if it had felt cornered a minute sooner, if I'd reached just a little farther under that tree, any of it could have ended in blood and screams instead of a wild story and a shaky laugh. Later that evening, after the fence was finished and the sun had set, I went out into the backyard again. It was quiet now. Still, the wind had died down, and for the first time all day, it was peaceful. I looked at the broken corner where the bear had pushed through, at the tracks still fresh in the dirt, the way the grass was trampled and crushed. It was real. It had all happened, and I still couldn't believe it. But I know one thing for sure. I'm fixing that damn screen door first thing in the morning. I woke up one morning in my house, a house that I was very familiar with. I was young, probably under 10 years old, but still old enough to be independent and used to the usual rhythms of my household. My mom worked nights, which meant she'd be asleep during the day. My dad was at work, of course, and that was the usual pattern. My brothers, Lucas and Rory, would typically sleep until around noon, so I was used to having some quiet time in the house by myself. But this morning was different. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. I rolled out of bed and wandered through the house, but something felt off. The usual noises weren't there. The creak of the floorboards, the sound of a faint hum from the fridge, even the distant sound of the wind outside. It was all gone. The house felt empty, like it was holding its breath. My mom's room was empty, and so was Lucas's and Rory's. I could hear the ticking of the clock in the living room, but it felt like it was the only sound in the whole house. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring that my mom had just gone out for a quick errand, or that maybe my brothers were at their friends' houses. But even as I turned on the TV to drown out the silence, it didn't help. The sound of the television, even turned up loud, just made the silence around it even more noticeable. The house felt hollow, like something was missing, like there should be more life in it. I tried to shake off the feeling and put on some music, but the same heavy silence pressed down on me. Even the sunlight coming through the windows seemed dim, like the world outside was covered in a thick gray fog. The weather was overcast, and it made everything feel even more desolate. I started to feel a little uneasy, but I tried to tell myself it was just a bad mood, or maybe I was just imagining things. After a while, I began to feel sick. I wasn't sure if it was the unease settling in my stomach or something else. but I felt like I needed to check in with my family. I picked up the phone and dialed my mom's number. No answer. I tried my dad next, but it just rang and rang. I moved on to Lucas and Rory, but neither of them picked up either. At that point, I was starting to panic, even if I didn't want to admit it to myself. Something just didn't feel right. I called again and again and again. Each time the phone would ring unanswered. The longer I sat there in the house, the heavier the air felt. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was a feeling, something I couldn't quite place, but it made my skin crawl. The clock on the wall seemed louder now, its ticking almost mocking me. Then I heard it. It started softly at first, like a faint whistle. I paused, straining my ears to listen. It was almost melodic, but there was something off about it. The tune was too repetitive, too hollow, like it wasn't really there, like it was just something in the air. It felt wrong. I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, so I tried to ignore it. But then it came again, louder this time, and I knew it wasn't in my head. It was coming from downstairs. I froze. I had no idea who could be in the house, but I knew it wasn't anyone I was expecting. My family wasn't home, and there was no reason for anyone else to be here. The whistling was odd, too. It sounded like the kind of whistling you'd hear from a villain in a horror movie, that eerie, unsettling melody that made your blood run cold. It wasn't normal. It wasn't a tune someone would just hum casually. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart began to race. I couldn't move. I wanted to investigate, to figure out what it was, but my feet wouldn't budge. The longer I sat there, the more the whistling seemed to creep into my mind, like it was pulling me deeper into something I didn't want to understand. My mind was spinning. Was I really alone? Was it someone trying to mess with me? It didn't feel like a prank, though. Not at all. The whistling had an edge to it, a chilling, dark energy that made me want to crawl into a corner and hide. I couldn't stay there any longer. I started crying, silently at first, then harder as the fear began to bubble over. My phone was still in my hand, and I kept dialing my parents' numbers over and over, but no one was picking up. The whistling stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe it was my chance to get out of there. But then, there was something else. It sounded like laughter, but not real laughter. It sounded like a toy, the kind that makes a noise when you press a button, but it wasn't the kind of laugh a toy would make. It was distorted, like it had been warped somehow. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of that house. But when I opened the door to leave, I saw my brother standing there. "Lucas, where are you going?" he asked, his face confused. I stared at him, stunned. I was so sure I had been alone. He looked just as confused as I felt. He told me he'd been home, that he'd been watching TV too. I asked him if he had heard the whistling. He nodded, his face pale. He'd heard it too. We were both creeped out, but neither of us knew what was going on. We decided to leave the house together. Maybe we'd find some comfort out on the street, away from whatever was happening in there. We walked out, and I felt a little better just being outside in the fresh air. It was still overcast, but at least I wasn't alone anymore. As we walked down the street, we saw Rory coming towards us. He looked just as shaken as we did, and when we talked, it turned out he had heard the whistling too, and the laughter. He said it had even seemed to echo outside, in the streets, which didn't make any sense. None of us knew what was happening, but we all felt the same way. It wasn't just a strange noise. It was something else, something that didn't fit with the world we knew. We decided to go to the Shell station. It was right across the street from my house, and maybe seeing some other people would help. The person behind the counter seemed off. They didn't make eye contact, barely acknowledged us. I could feel my heart beating faster as I stood there, and I wanted to leave right away. The bakers at the bakery across the way weren't their usual friendly selves either. Normally, they were talkative and kind, always smiling when I came in. But today, they barely looked at us, like they were preoccupied or scared of something. Rory even popped into the bar nearby, and when he came out, he said the staff seemed just as strange. They didn't smile or greet him like they normally would. They barely acknowledged his presence, like they were distant and unfocused. We didn't stay long. We left the stores and walked down to the school playground, just to get away from the weirdness. We spent the rest of the afternoon there, until it started getting dark. None of us talked much about the day. It felt like if we said it out loud, it would make everything feel more real, and that terrified me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been very wrong. When we returned home, everything seemed normal again. My parents didn't ask where I'd been. The house felt like it always did, filled with the noise and warmth that made it home. The silence that had filled the place earlier was gone, but I couldn't forget what had happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the house, and it was as if nothing had changed. But something had. I knew it. I had to find out what had happened, so I decided to check the basement. I figured if the whistling had come from somewhere, maybe it was down there. When I opened the door to the basement, my stomach churned. It felt even colder than usual, and the air smelled stale. I started walking down the stairs slowly, my feet feeling heavy with every step. When I reached the bottom, I looked around, my eyes scanning the dimly lit room. And that's when I saw it. One of my stuffed bears, a plush toy I had left on my bed, was sitting on the floor in the corner. It was the one I had always slept with, the one I loved the most. I hadn't seen it down here earlier, but there it was, sitting innocently against the wall. I couldn't help but feel like it had something to do with the whistling. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. The bear didn't have a music box or anything that could make noise. It was just a simple stuffed animal. I don't know why it was in the basement, but I didn't want it in my house anymore. I left the basement, carrying the bear with me, and put it outside, away from the house. The next day, my brother tried to convince me that it had all been some sort of prank. He said I was just overreacting, that I'd imagined it all. But there was no way it was a prank. There was no way he could have gotten the whole neighborhood to act like that. The people at the Shell station, the bakery, the bar, they all acted differently, like they were in on something I didn't understand. My dad wouldn't have ignored 20 missed calls, all one after the other. In the days that followed, Lucas seemed to forget all about what had happened. He brushed it off like it was nothing. Rory, too, didn't want to talk about it. He said he'd rather not bring it up. I didn't push it, but I knew something had happened. Something that didn't fit with what I understood about the world. I still don't know what it was. Maybe it was just a series of strange coincidences, but I still get chills when I think about the whistling. I can still hear it in my head, that eerie, unsettling tune that makes my skin crawl. I haven't been able to forget it, and I don't think I ever will. I used to work the overnight shift in a high-rise office building downtown, midnight to 8 in the morning. Not many people around during those hours, and honestly, it suited me. I liked the quiet. The building was modern, clean, always well lit, and kept at a crisp temperature overnight. There were motion sensors on the lights, badge locks on the stairwells and elevators, and security at the front desk until about 2 a.m. It always felt safe. I worked on the 14th floor. It wasn't a glamorous job, mostly processing reports, maintaining systems, and being available in case someone needed something urgent. It was lonely at times, but peaceful too. I had the place more or less to myself once the cleaning crew left. But staying alert for a full 8 hours in silence, under artificial lighting, staring at screens, it wore on me. I started using my lunch break, which was usually around 3:30 or 4 a.m., to take naps. The office was busy during the day, but by the early morning hours, most of the lower floors were empty. I started going down to the second floor to sleep. That floor was used mostly for large meetings and conferences, rows of rooms and waiting areas. At night, it was dead quiet. No people, no meetings, just shadows and silence. The lights were motion activated, so they stayed off unless someone walked by. That, paired with the building turning off the heating after hours to save energy, made the place cold. Not freezing, but definitely enough to keep a coat on. I'd bring my jacket and use it as a blanket, folding it over my chest or wrapping it around my legs depending on how I lay. There was a spot I liked, a curved hallway that went around the outer part of the building. It had soft chairs set out in pairs so people waiting for meetings had somewhere to sit. If you pushed 2 of them together, they made a decent makeshift bed. I found one place, tucked behind a wide concrete pillar near a window, where I could push the chairs together and lie out of view. From there, no one walking the hallway would see me unless they came directly around the curve. It was private and, in its own way, kind of cozy. The only downside was that for some reason, the motion sensor lights in that part of the hallway were wired backward. Instead of turning on when they sensed movement, they would shut off. I learned that the first time I sat down and the overhead fluorescence clicked off. It was strange, but not something I thought much about. I just lie back and cover my eyes with the jacket sleeve or fold it up over my face. By the time the timer kicked and the lights came back on, I was usually already asleep. So this one night, or morning really around 3:30, I grabbed my coat, told myself I'd just rest my eyes, and went down the stairs to the second floor like I always did. It was a Thursday night turning into Friday. I remember because it had been a slow week. No tickets, no issues. Just the hum of machines and the occasional email. I walked down the dark hallway, my footsteps quiet on the carpet. As I got close to my spot, the lights in the hall turned off, as expected. I pushed the 2 chairs together, tucked in behind the pillar, curled up with my coat pulled over my chest, and closed my eyes. The cold helped, honestly. It made the spot feel more like a proper sleeping area. Not too warm, not too uncomfortable. Just right. The quiet stretched out around me, broken now and then by the distant sound of a car passing by outside or the faint click of pipes adjusting to the temperature. It couldn't have been more than a minute before I heard footsteps. They were steady and deliberate, not rushed. I figured it was a janitor making his rounds. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes they did a sweep around the time I was taking my nap. I didn't worry about it. My ID badge was clipped to my waist, and I wasn't doing anything wrong, really. Just taking a break. I kept still, expecting the footsteps to pass, but instead I heard keys. The jingle of metal on metal, rhythmic and casual, like someone walking with a full ring of them at their hip. I waited for the person to come around the corner. I even tensed slightly, expecting to feel a bit embarrassed if they looked down and saw me sleeping there. But the steps didn't pass. They came closer, and then stopped. Not just stopped entirely. Stopped just out of sight, like they were around the bend of the hallway, just before the curve that would bring them into view. And then I realized they hadn't really stopped. The footsteps and the jingling kept going, like someone marching in place. I listened harder. Still no motion in my line of sight, no shadow, no figure. Just the sound of someone steadily shifting their weight from foot to foot, the keys bouncing softly. I lay there frozen, not out of fear exactly, but because I didn't want to get caught and have to explain myself. But after a while, the unease crept in. It was a weird sound, too deliberate, too persistent. I waited. Still, the person didn't come around the corner. A few more seconds passed, or maybe a full minute. I wasn't sure. Then I tried to lift my head, just enough to peek. But I couldn't move. It was like something had clamped down on my body. I could feel my muscles straining, but my head wouldn't lift, and my limbs wouldn't respond. Panic started to build in the back of my throat. I thought maybe I had fallen asleep faster than I realized, and was in that half-sleep state. Sleep paralysis. I'd had it before on certain medications, but never like this. I rolled onto my back with effort, gritting my teeth. My breathing had gone shallow, and I could only open my eyes a tiny bit. I could see light, but not shapes. And then the lights shut off. I was plunged into darkness. Real darkness, the kind where your eyes search for edges and find nothing. The footsteps, still in place a second ago, began again, this time moving. They were headed my way. The jingling of keys got louder. Closer. I tried to move again, desperate now. I could feel the adrenaline rush, the cold sweat starting. My chest was rising and falling rapidly. I strained with everything I had, but my arms and legs refused to respond. Then I felt it. 2 solid hands pressing down on my chest. Not sharp or aggressive, but heavy, controlled, like someone deliberately pinning me down. The pressure increased until it felt like a full-grown man had climbed on top of me, knees on either side, palms planted on my chest like anchors. I couldn't breathe properly. I couldn't shout. I couldn't see who or what it was. The keys were there too, pressed against my coat, digging slightly into the fabric. I could feel their weight, the cold of the metal through the cloth. I wanted to scream. My mouth barely opened. My jaw wouldn't work. It felt like an eternity. I don't know how long it really lasted. Maybe a minute, maybe less. But in the moment, it felt endless. The worst part wasn't the pressure, it was the helplessness. The utter inability to move, to defend myself, to even see. Then the pressure disappeared. Suddenly it was gone. Just lifted. I gasped and managed to pry my eyes open wider. Nothing. No one. The hallway was empty. No weight on my chest, no shadows overhead, no movement around me. The footsteps were receding, the keys jingling softly again, around the bend and into the distance. I finally managed to sit up, and that's when I saw that the chairs weren't where I had left them. They were no longer pushed up neatly behind the pillar. They were out in the open now, right in the middle of the hallway, exposed. I had been lying there, not hidden at all. My jacket had fallen half off. I pulled it up and looked around. The lights were still off, meaning something had been moving there just moments ago. I stood slowly. My legs were weak, and my breathing hadn't fully calmed down yet. I looked down both ends of the hallway. Nothing. Just long stretches of empty floor and silent walls. My heart was still hammering as I picked up my jacket and turned to go. That's when I started hearing a low hum, like static or electricity. Not loud, just faint. A background buzz I hadn't noticed before. As I walked, I rubbed my face with my sleeve, trying to clear the sweat from my skin. I felt dazed, almost like I had been drugged or pulled out of deep anesthesia. Then I stopped. I was back behind the pillar. The chairs were where I had originally pushed them. My coat was on my chest. The lights overhead were on. The hallway was quiet. No keys. No footsteps. No cold sweat. Just me lying there, eyes open now, staring at the ceiling lights as they glowed quietly above me. I didn't know what to think. I sat up slowly, every muscle still tense. I looked around again. Everything was normal, exactly how I left it. I pressed a hand to my chest and could still feel the phantom impression of those hands. The keys were nowhere to be seen. I picked up my things and left, taking the stairs back up to the 14th floor, pausing at every landing to listen. I didn't hear a single sound. When I got back to my desk, I stared at the monitor for a long time without seeing anything. Later, when I told a coworker about what happened, I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe I had dozed off and experienced sleep paralysis. Maybe it was my body reacting to the cold floor, or the angle I was sleeping at, or something deeper in my brain that I didn't understand. He told me, while scrolling his phone and not even really paying attention, that someone had supposedly died during the construction of the building. A fall. Suicide, maybe. Some people had talked about it years ago. He said others had claimed to hear things too, keys mostly. I brushed it off. It was stupid. Coincidence. Brain chemicals. It had to be. But I haven't gone back to the second floor since. And even now, when the floor above me creaks or a door clicks shut somewhere down the hall, I feel the echo of cold keys on my chest and the weight of something that wasn't there. It was a last-minute decision, but something about the northern Minnesota National Park had been calling me. Maybe it was the mix of the dense, untouched forest and the peace it promised. Or maybe I just needed to escape from the rush of daily life for a while. I had always loved being in nature, though I'd never been the bravest when it came to camping. The woods were beautiful, but they had a certain energy about them that made me more aware of the darkness than I liked to admit. I wasn't superstitious, but the idea of being alone in a deep forest, far from civilization, gave me a strange feeling. I always chalked it up to just a healthy respect for nature, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. This trip, however, felt different. It wasn't the forest I was scared of, but more the thoughts that crept into my mind when I was alone. I told myself I'd be fine, that the beauty of the park would be enough to take my mind off things. My friends and I set out with light spirits, enjoying the crisp air and the way the sun filtered through the trees. The trail was well-trodden, and the walk was easy at first, with the occasional mud patch to navigate around. There was a sense of camaraderie among us, the kind you get when you're out in the wilderness with people you trust. I liked that. It made everything feel less daunting. By the time we reached a clearing to rest, I was starting to feel the fatigue set in. My legs ached from the uneven terrain, and I could tell my body was starting to protest. I wasn't one to complain, though. The last thing I wanted was to slow everyone down. We sat for a while, eating snacks and enjoying the view. The forest stretched out before us like a vast sea of green. I couldn't help but admire how untouched it was. There's something peaceful about a place that's been left to its own devices for so long. The break was short-lived, and soon enough, we were back on the trail. I felt like I was moving slower than I wanted to, but I was determined not to fall behind. My friends were a few paces ahead, chatting and laughing as they made their way along the path. I struggled to keep up, pushing myself harder than I probably should have. The mud made every step feel like I was trudging through molasses, and I was starting to feel it in my legs. I was the last in our group now, and the familiar sounds of laughter and conversation had faded away. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was normal for the group to spread out a bit, but as time went on, I realized I had lost sight of the others entirely. It wasn't alarming at first. It was still early in the day, only around 10 a.m., and I could hear them just ahead of me. The sounds of their footsteps, the occasional murmur of conversation, drifted back through the trees. I kept going, moving steadily but with increasing exhaustion. My body was sore, my feet were wet, and I was starting to feel a little off balance from the fatigue. Still, I told myself to push through. I wasn't far from them. I could hear them, right? I told myself to stay calm, that I'd catch up soon. Minutes turned into 20. The sounds of my friends were still faint, and I found myself questioning if I was hearing them at all, or if I was just imagining it. I called out for them to slow down, but the only response was a muffled reply I could barely make out. It was distant, too distant. My stomach dropped, and I immediately picked up my pace, my steps faster now as my mind began to race. I yelled again, louder this time, but there was no response. Panic crept up my spine like a slow-moving cold wave. I was starting to think something was wrong. Why couldn't they hear me? Why weren't they answering? They weren't that far ahead. I knew that much. I could hear them, but now it was almost as if I was starting to mix their sounds with my own movements. I knew the path well enough. I had paid attention at the beginning, but it felt different now. The familiar landscape suddenly seemed unfamiliar. I glanced around, hoping to spot them, but there was nothing but dense vegetation, the occasional fallen log, and thick patches of mud. My heartbeat quickened. The trees pressed in on me, the leaves rustling softly, but nothing else seemed alive. The sounds of the birds, the wind, the insects, everything seemed to stop all at once. The silence was deafening. It wasn't the normal quiet of the woods, the kind you get when the animals are resting or when the wind dies down. This was something deeper, like the forest had frozen in time. I scanned the surroundings, my eyes darting nervously between the trees. My throat went dry, and a strange sensation settled over me, like something was watching from the shadows. I quickly dismissed it, telling myself it was just paranoia. The woods had a way of making you feel small, but it was nothing more than a trick of the mind. I was still trying to catch up, though I had no idea where I was going. I could feel the exhaustion in my bones, the heaviness in my arms and legs. It was becoming harder to move quickly, but I had no choice. I couldn't stop. My watch told me it was 11:05, but for some reason, it seemed wrong. The time didn't feel right. It was like I had lost track of where I was, how long I'd been walking. The minutes dragged on like hours. My body was heavy, and every step felt like it took more effort than the last. I felt dizzy, disoriented. The silence was crushing now, like the forest had become a vacuum, pulling in every sound until only my labored breathing remained. I had no idea what had happened. Where was everyone? What had gone wrong? I couldn't even tell if I was still on the right path. The trees all looked the same, and the mud was starting to feel like quicksand. I pulled out my hunting knife, more for comfort than anything else. The sharp edge glinted in the dim light, but it felt like a flimsy defense against whatever I thought might be out there. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things or if there was something in the woods with me, but the feeling of being watched was unshakable. Another 30 minutes passed, but it felt like an eternity. My watch had stopped at 11:05, and my phone was turned off, just in case. I hadn't had a signal since we entered the park. My throat felt raw from calling out, and my voice had nearly vanished. I tried to convince myself that my friends weren't far, that I was just having an off moment, but I was losing grip on reality. The exhaustion, the isolation, the silence, everything was starting to blur together. I wanted to stop and sit down, but I was too afraid. The forest was too quiet. My mind was too loud. I couldn't stay still. I couldn't stop moving. I had to find them. I had to get out of here. I took a moment to breathe, trying to settle the panic that was rising in my chest. I called out one last time, my voice hoarse and weak. I didn't expect a response. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, and every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. My feet felt like lead, and my legs were beginning to buckle under me, but I refused to stop. That's when I heard it. A rustling. Not the faint noise of wind or distant animals. No, this was something else. Something behind me. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest, and nearly lost my balance on the uneven path. My eyes locked on something moving through the trees, but it wasn't what I had expected. My friends were there, just a few feet away, rounding a bend in the path. I froze, my brain struggling to process what was happening. How was this possible? I had been alone, lost, and now they were here. It didn't make sense. Confusion hit me like a wave. I started laughing, a hysterical sound that felt out of place in the stillness of the woods. My friends looked at me, wide-eyed, asking what was going on. How had I gotten ahead of them? They were confused, but I couldn't even begin to explain. My mind was a mess, my body shaking from the terror and exhaustion. They were just as puzzled as I was, but when they checked their watches, the confusion deepened. It had only been 10 minutes. 10 minutes. I felt my stomach lurch as I glanced at my watch. It read 11:42 a.m. I must have been hallucinating, right? A malfunction, I told myself. It was just the watch. It was a cheap thing anyway. My phone had been off, and the watch relied on Bluetooth to sync. That must have been the issue. But even as I tried to convince myself, the unease didn't go away. We quickly decided it was time to leave. We didn't stick around to figure out what had happened. The forest had already taken too much from me. As we made our way back to the campsite, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The woods felt different now, unfamiliar, like they were hiding something. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. When I was about 10, I spent the night at my friend Amy's house for a sleepover. It wasn't my first sleepover at her place, but this one stuck with me. Amy's house was an older one, not too big, but big enough to feel cozy. It was a quiet street on the outskirts of town, with lots of trees, and at night, it always felt a little too still. The kind of stillness that makes you think you might hear something if you listen closely enough. That night, I remember feeling especially calm, the kind of calm you get when you're tucked under a thick quilt, ready to settle into a good night's sleep. Amy was already asleep in her bed, and I was on a mattress on the floor. The mattress was positioned in such a way that if I sat up, I could see straight down the hallway that led into the living room. To the left was Amy's mom's bedroom, and to the right was the bathroom. The hallway was dimly lit, but just enough for me to make out shapes in the darkness. Amy was the kind of person who got scared easily, no matter what it was. If a door creaked or a floorboard groaned, she'd be the first to jump. I remember this one time, we were watching a movie in the living room, and she had to hide behind a pillow during the scary parts. At that point, I thought it was kind of funny, but looking back, I can see how she was just a little more sensitive to things than the rest of us. Around midnight, I heard the dogs next door barking. The noise cut through the stillness of the night, loud and insistent. It wasn't unusual for the dogs to bark at night, but it still caught me off guard. I sat up, my eyes adjusting to the dark, and I could see Amy stirring in her bed across the room. I don't think she was fully awake, but she definitely wasn't asleep anymore. She pulled her blanket up over her head and rolled over, looking toward me. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice shaky. I nodded, even though I wasn't scared. "It's just the dogs. Don't worry about it." I tried to sound as calm as I could, but her fear was starting to make me second-guess myself. She was still scared, though, pulling the blanket over her head like it would somehow protect her. "I can't sleep," she said, her voice small. "I'm scared." I rolled my eyes, feeling a bit frustrated. "It's fine, Amy. Just go back to bed." I tried to be reassuring, but she wasn't having it. A few seconds later, I heard her shuffling across the room, and before I knew it, she was crawling into bed with her mom. I stayed awake for a while, just staring at the ceiling. The dogs outside kept barking, and I found myself listening to every distant sound that came from outside the house. The wind through the trees, the rustling of the leaves, it was all so familiar, yet it felt off that night. I eventually drifted off to sleep, though I wasn't sure how long it took. The next thing I remember was waking up to the light of the early morning creeping in through the window. It was probably around 5 o'clock or 5:15 a.m. Still too early to get up, but my mind was already awake. I squinted at the soft glow of daylight starting to break through the curtains. For a moment, everything seemed normal. I was still lying on the mattress on the floor, and the house was quiet, except for the occasional sound of a bird chirping outside. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought I was still dreaming, or maybe still half asleep. But there, sitting on the couch in the living room, was Amy's Aunt Sandra. She was sitting with her back slightly hunched, elbows on her knees, her head tilted down toward the floor. I could see her dark hair, her features shadowed in the dim light. She was staring directly at me, unmoving. It was like she was waiting for something. I couldn't believe it at first. Sandra didn't live nearby, and she only visited when she was on leave from the Air Force. She was always nice, but I had never seen her sit like this, staring at me so intensely. I felt a chill creep up my spine, and my heart started to race. I stared back at her, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I don't know how long we sat there like that, me staring at her staring at me. I could hear my own breath, the air feeling thick in my chest. I kept thinking maybe she was just really tired, or maybe I was still groggy from just waking up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't the way she was sitting. It was the way she was staring at me like she was expecting me to do something, or maybe waiting for me to react. Suddenly, she looked away. Not quickly, just slowly, like she realized she had been staring at me for too long. And that's when I noticed something strange. She didn't get up. She didn't move at all. She just turned her head toward the window, and I could see her profile now. My breath caught in my throat. I had to be imagining it. Maybe I was still dreaming. I tried to shake off the feeling, but I couldn't get back to sleep. I kept my eyes on her for a few more minutes, but eventually, I must have drifted off again because the next thing I knew, the sun was up, and I could hear movement in the house. When I finally woke up, the room was brighter, and the birds outside were chirping louder. I stretched and rubbed my eyes, still feeling a bit groggy. It was around 8:30 a.m., a much more reasonable time to get up. I stood up, rolled the blanket off, and walked down the hall to the living room. I was expecting to see Amy's mom sitting on the couch, maybe watching TV, but when I walked in, the room was empty. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe Amy's mom had already gone to the kitchen or was getting breakfast ready. But then I remembered Sandra. "Where's Aunt Sandra?" I asked, my voice soft, unsure if I'd said her name right. Amy's mom looked at me, her face a little confused. "Sandra? Oh, Sandra's not here, honey. She's still in X City with her husband. She won't be here for a while." I froze. My mind raced, and I felt a cold shiver run down my back. But she was sitting on the couch this morning. I saw her. Amy's mom just stared at me for a long moment, like she didn't know what to say. Then, with a shrug, she said, "You must have been dreaming. Sandra hasn't been here in a few weeks." I didn't know what to make of it. I was sure I hadn't been dreaming. I could still see her sitting there, her eyes locked on mine, her stillness so strange. But Amy's mom didn't seem to think much of it. She didn't even look worried. I was left standing there, feeling like something was wrong, but not knowing how to explain it. It's been almost 30 years since that night, and I still don't have a real answer for what happened. I'm not sure if I really saw Aunt Sandra, or if my mind just played tricks on me. But every time I think about it, the image of her sitting on that couch, staring at me, comes back clear as day. I can still see her, and I can still feel that strange, unsettling chill that crept up my spine. Maybe I was just a kid, but I swear it wasn't a dream. Something, or someone was there that night, and I'll never forget it. I lived alone in a ground-floor apartment at the time, a small but comfortable space in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The building was a single story with a few units that shared a modest parking lot, and it was the kind of place where you could hear a pin drop in the dead of night. The apartment was cozy, and the windows let in a lot of natural light during the day. The kitchen, though small, was well organized, and I liked to keep things neat. It was around midnight when I went to bed that night, though sleep was never something that came easy to me. I often stayed up late, my mind racing with everything and nothing at the same time. On a good night, I'd finally drift off around 2 a.m., but on this particular night, I actually managed to fall asleep sooner. Everything was calm, the kind of deep, quiet sleep I rarely experienced, when suddenly, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. It was sharp, sudden, and it tore through the quiet like a thunderclap. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what I'd just heard. It came from the next room, my kitchen. My first thought was that it was my two cats. They were always getting into trouble, knocking things over, chasing each other around the apartment in bursts of wild energy. I barely registered the time, my brain still half in sleep mode, as I rolled over, reaching for the blanket to get up. But when I tried to pull it back, I couldn't. My two cats were there, huddled against my hip, their small bodies pressed tightly into me. I could feel their fur against my skin, but it wasn't the warmth that made me freeze. No, it was the way they were acting. They were absolutely terrified. I could feel the tension in their muscles, the tightness in their posture. Their eyes were wide, huge, dilated pupils, staring into the darkness with a level of fear I had never seen in them before. Their ears were flat against their heads, and their fur was puffed up like they had been electrocuted. These were adult cats that had moved with me across the country, lived in different places with all kinds of noise, other animals, and commotion. They were not easily frightened. I had seen them face down dogs and strange people without so much as a flicker of concern. But now, they were terrified, frozen in place, unable to look away from the dark hallway leading to the kitchen. It was that moment that hit me harder than anything else. My cats, who had never shown fear, were completely paralyzed by something I couldn't see. I don't know why, but my first instinct wasn't to stay in bed and keep safe. My mind didn't race to any logical explanation. It just reacted out of irritation, maybe even anger, that I had been woken from a deep sleep. I wasn't thinking clearly, just feeling the frustration of being disturbed. And with that, I threw the blanket off me and stood up. I didn't check the time, but I knew it was late, very late. Maybe 3 a.m., maybe later. I moved out of the bedroom and into the hall, my footsteps muffled by the thin carpet. The whole apartment was dark, with only the faintest sliver of moonlight creeping through the blinds. I wasn't armed, I wasn't prepared. Just me and my body, my adrenaline, moving instinctively toward the source of the noise. When I reached the kitchen, I flipped on the light. I almost wish I had found a burglar. That would have made sense. I could have handled that. But there was no burglar. Instead, there was the mess. The dish drainer, the one I'd left on the counter next to the sink before going to bed, was now lying at the foot of the stove. It had been launched, thrown, shoved, I couldn't tell exactly, across the kitchen with a force I couldn't explain. The ceramic bowl that had been in the drainer was shattered, and the dish towel I had left neatly folded was now halfway across the kitchen floor, lying in the center as if it had been tossed with intent. The whole thing was like a photograph burned into my mind. The way the dish drainer was half appended, the bowl broken at the base of the stove, the dish towel stretched across the floor like it had been dragged there. I stood there, dumbfounded. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It wasn't like the cats had knocked it over. No, this was different. This was deliberate. And it wasn't just the mess. It was the force behind it, the suddenness, the intensity that left me feeling like something had taken over the room. The room felt wrong. I felt like I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. The silence was pressing in on me, heavy and oppressive. I tried to collect myself. The anger I'd felt earlier, the desire to scold my cats, was now replaced with confusion and a strange, unsettling sense of dread. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just disturbed. I picked up the dish drainer, set it back on the counter where it had been, and began to gather up the rest of the mess. The bowl was useless, shattered, so I discarded it with a quick sweep of my hand. The towel went back in the laundry basket, the silverware into the trash, and the plastic container went back on the counter. But even as I moved, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened, something that I wasn't understanding, something that didn't make sense. With the kitchen now looking normal again, I shut off the light and walked back to my bed, my feet heavy against the carpet. My cats were still huddled on the bed, their wide eyes watching me, but they seemed to have regained a sense of control. Their fur was still puffed up, but they weren't as rigid anymore. They looked at me as if to say, "We don't know either, but we're not leaving." I laid back down, trying to convince myself it had been nothing. Maybe just a weird dream. Maybe the cats had knocked it over in their panic. But as I closed my eyes, trying to force myself back to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something. I wasn't sure what it was, but there was something wrong with that moment, something I didn't fully understand. I must have fallen back asleep eventually, because the next thing I knew, the morning light was streaming through the blinds. My mind was foggy, and I was hoping, praying, that the whole thing had been a dream. A bad dream. Something I had imagined in my half-awake state. But when I walked into the kitchen, the dish drainer and the mess were exactly where I had left them. The dish towel still lay half across the floor, the bowl shattered in the same spot. I didn't know what to make of it. I'm not the kind of person to jump to supernatural conclusions. I wasn't raised to believe in ghosts or spirits, and I wasn't going to start now. But the question lingered. What had happened? Why had my cats reacted that way? Why was the kitchen such a mess, like something had been thrown across the room with force? Why had I felt that presence in the air, that oppressive weight of something unseen? Over the years, I've told a few people about it, but it's hard to explain the feeling. The malice, the intent, the sheer force behind it all. I don't have an answer. I don't know what happened that night, and I'm not sure I want to know. All I know is that I'll never forget the way my cats looked at me in the dark, their eyes wide with fear, and I'll never forget the way the kitchen looked when I turned on the light. In the end, maybe it was just some freak accident. Maybe my cats caused the mess, and I didn't realize it. Maybe there was some natural explanation. But deep down, I don't think so. There's something about that night, something that doesn't sit right, and it's never left me. When I was around 10 years old, I had this big, fat black cat named Sabbath. He was one of those cats who seemed to understand everything, and we were thick as thieves. The kind of cat that would curl up with me on my bed for hours, purring so loudly I could barely hear anything else. He was sweet and patient, despite my incessant teasing. I remember being a little too rough with him sometimes, picking him up when I shouldn't, pulling his tail, but he never once scratched or bit me. Just a gentle, loving cat who always forgave me, no matter what I did. Sabbath was getting old, and we all knew it. He started getting sick a lot, throwing up his food, losing weight, becoming lethargic. We took him to the vet, and after a few tests, the diagnosis was clear: severe diabetes. The vet said it would require daily insulin shots and special food, and that wasn't going to be cheap. My mom was already struggling financially, and there was no way we could afford the ongoing treatment. It broke my heart to know that Sabbath's life had to end because we just couldn't afford to keep him around. I didn't want to say goodbye. I couldn't bring myself to do it. The day we took him to the vet to put him down, I stayed in my room, crying silently, refusing to go. I couldn't bear the thought of watching him go. It wasn't until later, after the decision was made, that I regretted it. I wish I had said something, even if it was just a simple goodbye. I never got the chance to tell him how much he meant to me. Weeks passed. I tried to carry on like normal, but it was tough. Every now and then, I'd find myself looking at the spot on my bed where he used to sleep. It was empty, and I'd feel this aching void, like something fundamental was missing. My parents didn't speak much about it, probably because they were still dealing with the emotional fallout themselves. But every so often, I'd catch my mom's eyes lingering on the spot where Sabbath used to lay, and I knew she was feeling the same emptiness I was. One day, I was sitting in my room, staring at the screen of my computer. It was late afternoon, maybe early evening, and the sun was starting to dip behind the trees outside. I was still a little too young to have a lot of responsibilities, so I spent a lot of my free time playing video games or watching TV. I wasn't feeling tired, just sort of zoning out. My computer desk was cluttered with books, random papers, and a few toys I hadn't yet put away. But one of the things that always caught my eye was this little red laser pointer I had found at a yard sale. I don't remember what drew me to it, but for some reason, I always kept it on the desk near the foot of my bed. I was just lying there, staring at the screen when, out of nowhere, the laser pointer flickered on. I hadn't touched it. I didn't even know if it had been working properly, since I hadn't used it in a while. I figured it was a glitch, but the weird thing was, it flickered on and off like someone was pressing the button. I sat up, confused, and stared at it. It stopped flickering the moment I moved. I thought it was odd, but I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just the batteries running low or something. But then it flickered again. The same exact pattern. On for a second, off for a second, then back on again. I wasn't one to scare easily, but something about the way it flickered felt purposeful, like it was trying to get my attention. My heart started racing, but I tried to brush it off. I even reached over and grabbed the laser, thinking maybe I had somehow triggered it by moving too quickly or something. But the moment I held it in my hand, it stopped. I felt a bit stupid, like maybe I had imagined the whole thing, but then, out of nowhere, it flickered again. Now, I wasn't so sure. I set the laser pointer back down on the desk and just stared at it. It flickered again, and this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't a normal flicker. It was as if the laser was trying to tell me something. I don't know why, but I said it aloud. "Are you trying to tell me something?" I felt silly even saying it, but I had to ask. Almost as if to answer, the laser blinked once. I froze. It had to be a coincidence. There was no way a stupid little laser pointer was doing what I thought it was. It couldn't be possible. But then, I felt this weird, heavy sensation in my chest. Like something was pulling at me, something deep inside my gut telling me that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a coincidence. I took a deep breath, and for some reason I asked, "Are you a ghost?" I didn't know why I asked it, but I did. The laser blinked once. At that point, I was both freaked out and oddly intrigued. I didn't believe in ghosts. I was an atheist, a skeptic through and through, but I couldn't explain what was happening. The laser had been sitting there, unused, and now it was responding to me. I looked around my room, trying to make sense of it all, but there was nothing to see. Just the quiet hum of the house around me. I sat there frozen, thinking for a long time, and then I asked, "Is it you, Sabbath?" One blink. Just one. I felt a chill run down my spine, but not in the way I had expected. It wasn't terrifying. It was more like a heavy weight, a presence. I started to tear up. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like Sabbath. Like he was still here somehow, even though he was gone. I continued asking questions. It wasn't a long conversation, really, just simple things. Was it him? Was he okay? Did he forgive me for not saying goodbye? Each time, the laser blinked in response, a small confirmation that felt so real, so genuine, that I couldn't dismiss it as a trick of my mind. I don't remember all the questions I asked or the exact pattern of blinks, but I do remember the overwhelming sense of closure I felt as I sat there. It was like all the guilt, the regret, everything I had carried with me since Sabbath had passed. It all faded away in that moment. It was like he had come back, not to haunt me, but to reassure me that it was okay, that I hadn't done anything wrong, that I didn't need to feel guilty anymore. Eventually, the laser stopped flickering. I sat there for a long while, still staring at it, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But when I checked the laser, the batteries were dead, completely drained. I didn't even know how that was possible, considering I hadn't used it in so long. I sat there for a while longer, thinking about everything that had just happened. There was no rational explanation. I couldn't explain the way the laser had flickered in response to my questions, and I couldn't explain how it had stopped when I stopped asking. But I knew what it felt like. It felt real. It felt like my cat had come back, just for a moment, to make sure I knew he was okay. I never experienced anything like that again. No strange flickering lights, no eerie sounds, no unexplained events. But that one moment, those 30 minutes with that little laser pointer, it stayed with me. Even now, all these years later, I still think about it from time to time. I've tried to explain it away, but no matter how hard I try, I can't deny what happened. Sabbath never came back after that. But in a way, I didn't need him to. I had my closure. I had my answer. And that was enough. The year was 2001, and I was just 8 years old. My family had decided to take a drive across the state line to buy a used car. It was a big deal for us, buying a car from a nearby town instead of from the local dealership, trying to find something reliable and affordable. We left early in the morning, the road wide open and clear as we drove out of the city and into the countryside. I didn't know it then, but that was going to be one of those drives you never forget, the kind that you wish you could erase from your mind. But as I would come to learn, some things, some events, stay with you long after you wish they would go away. The drive out there had been smooth, almost too smooth. I remember watching the landscape change as we moved further from home, getting into open fields and small towns that seemed stuck in time. My dad was driving, my mom next to him, and I was in the back seat, looking out the window. I wasn't paying much attention to the road itself. It was just a typical drive. We stopped for a quick break at a gas station once we arrived. Then we spent the next few hours working out the details of the car purchase. By the time we were heading back home, the sky had begun to turn gray, threatening rain. We were on a 4-lane highway when it happened. 2 lanes in each direction, separated by a wide grassy ditch. The car we had just bought was running perfectly. I was still catching my breath from the excitement of the deal. The car was a great find, cheap and reliable. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something in the air felt heavy. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I remember being unusually aware of the quiet hum of the car's engine as we made our way back. We were about an hour or so from home when I noticed it. A small red car coming toward us, in the opposite lane, began to swerve. I don't know if it was because of the rain or the tired driver, but he started to drift. At first, it was a slight movement, just a quick correction, but then the car lurched further to the right. I saw the tires hit the edge of the road, skimming across the ditch. It happened so fast. One moment, he was there, and the next, his car was airborne, spinning in midair like a toy caught in a child's hand. Everything happened in what felt like a fraction of a second. The red car twisted and flipped over itself, the tires screeching as it rotated, and then it crashed down with a sickening thud. The driver's side window shattered, and a moment later I saw him. He was flung out of the car like a rag doll, his body thrown through the window, landing harshly on the road ahead of us. I could hear the sound of his body hitting the pavement, the sickening slap of skin and bone that I'll never forget. His body skidded across the road, and for a split second, I thought he might be dead right there. The car came to a stop a few feet away, its wheels spinning uselessly in the ditch. I don't know why we stopped. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the right thing to do. But we were there, just a few feet from this man's broken body. The world seemed to stop. The air grew colder, even though it hadn't been that cold before. My dad's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, but I could see his face, a mix of confusion and fear. He didn't want to stop, but he did, and we weren't alone. Other cars had pulled over, too, a few drivers who had seen the whole thing. Everyone was trying to figure out what had just happened. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. My eyes locked onto the man as he lay crumpled in the road. His face was twisted in agony, his legs bent at unnatural angles, and blood was pooling around him. I heard the faintest groans coming from him, guttural, desperate sounds that I'll never be able to erase. His mouth opened and closed, but I couldn't understand what he was trying to say. There was a wetness in the air, a stench of gasoline, blood, and something else, a smell I can only describe as burning rubber. The rain began to fall harder now, a fine mist that seemed to make everything more surreal. His body twitched, and I swear it felt like time had slowed down in those moments. I don't know how long we stayed there. My dad was talking to someone, probably trying to get an ambulance on the phone, but I couldn't really hear anything else. My mind was locked onto the scene ahead of us, my stomach in knots. I wanted to turn away, but something kept me staring. Something made me watch as this man's life slipped away. It was like I was paralyzed, my body refusing to react, even though my mind screamed at me to look away. But I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the horror that was unfolding before me. I remember the smell most of all. That odd combination of gasoline, blood, and of all things, pizza. There, near the man's wrecked car, I saw a Domino's pizza box half hanging out of the back of the car. The pizza had spilled onto the road, the box shredded and left behind in the chaos. I don't know why that struck me as so important, but it did. It was a strange, almost surreal detail that I could never forget. I remember thinking that this man had been just like any of us, probably on some routine delivery, something mundane and normal like any other day. But in an instant, it had all changed. In the blink of an eye, his whole life had come to a crashing halt. And now, instead of delivering pizza to someone's door, he was lying broken and bleeding in the middle of the highway. I couldn't stop thinking about that pizza box, half out of the car like some cruel joke. It reminded me of how easily we could all be caught up in something we never saw coming. We could be driving down the road, going through the motions, and then, just like that, life could change forever. In an instant, everything we take for granted could be ripped away from us. That's the kind of lesson a kid shouldn't learn at such a young age. As I stood there, still frozen, I couldn't shake the sound of the man's groans. They were constant, persistent, cutting through the rain and the growing silence that had settled over the crowd. Someone was trying to help him, but it didn't seem like there was much hope. I kept thinking to myself, if only he had worn his seatbelt, if only he had gotten some rest last night. The thoughts kept racing in my mind, running over and over, as if somehow I could fix it, as if my thoughts could reverse what had already happened. But it was too late. There was nothing anyone could do now. The ambulance arrived too late. When they loaded him onto the stretcher, I saw his body, lifeless, limp, his head tilted unnaturally. It was a scene that would stay with me forever. I didn't know it at the time, but I'd never forget the way his body looked as they wheeled him away. I didn't know what would happen to him, but I would later find out that he died at the hospital. His injuries were too severe, the damage to his body too great. And as much as I tried to block it out, I couldn't forget about that man. The man who had been just like me, just like anyone else, and yet in an instant, his life had been taken from him. The rest of the drive home was a blur. I don't remember much about it, except for the odd quiet that hung in the car. My parents didn't speak much, and I just stared out the window, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I kept thinking about that man, his body crumpled on the road, and the way his life had been cut short. I thought about the pizza box, the strange irony of it all. That pizza, probably meant for a family, now forgotten in the wake of tragedy. and I thought about how fragile life really is. How one moment we can be going about our daily lives, thinking everything is fine, and the next moment, everything can change. How quickly things can go from normal to a complete nightmare. It made me feel small, vulnerable. Like we're all just 1 second away from something we don't see coming. Years have passed since that day, but I still remember it. The groans, the blood, the smell of gasoline and pizza. It's something that I don't think I'll ever forget. Sometimes I think about that man, about what his life might have been like before the crash. And I think about the lesson I learned that day. That life is fragile, that everything we take for granted can be taken from us in an instant, and that we should never take a single day for granted. I don't know if it was the rain, or the way everything seemed so surreal, but that moment changed me. It showed me just how unpredictable life is. And no matter how careful we are, how safe we think we are, sometimes things just happen. And when they do, all we can do is pick up the pieces, learn from them, and keep moving forward. But we never forget. I spent a lot of time hiking in the coastal range of Oregon from 2012 to 2013. I was a lone traveler, always seeking that quiet corner of the world where the noise of people and civilization couldn't touch me. For most of my trips, I'd venture out on my own, with only a backpack, my trusty boots, and a cell phone, an outdated model that barely worked in the wilderness. No fancy GPS trackers, no emergency beacons, just me, the trail, and the wild. It wasn't the safest thing to do looking back on it, but I liked the solitude. It gave me peace. I often spent days in the wild, camping out in spots that weren't popular or even marked on a map. I'd hike for miles until I found the perfect place to set up camp, usually beside a stream or tucked into a small clearing. I'd stay for a few days, maybe a week, then restock in a small town about 6 miles away before heading back. The town wasn't anything special, just a few shops, a small diner, and enough people to make you feel grounded before returning to the vastness of the forest. Most people didn't hike these trails, so the places I camped were often deserted. But that also meant no one was around if something went wrong. It was May of 2013 when things changed. I had made my usual trek into town to stock up on food. The town was small, quiet, and filled with the kind of people who were used to the isolation. I spent most of the day there, getting what I needed and grabbing a warm meal at the diner before heading back. The sun was already dipping below the horizon as I started my hike back to camp. The last few miles were the hardest, as they took me off the dirt roads and onto a narrow deer trail that snaked through the dense forest. By the time I veered off the main trail, the sky had turned to dusk, and only the faint light from the moon illuminated the path before me. I don't listen to music while hiking. It's something I've always avoided. Too many things can go wrong if you don't hear what's around you, whether it's a bear, a mountain lion, or, God forbid, another person with bad intentions. So, I hiked in silence, the sounds of the forest the only music to my ears. The crunch of dirt and leaves underfoot, the rustling of branches in the wind. These were the sounds that kept me grounded. My mind often wandered during these hikes. I'd think about the next day's trail, the wildlife I'd seen earlier in the day, or even my plans for after the hike. But this time was different. As I walked through the forest, my thoughts abruptly stopped. It wasn't a sound that drew me out of my reverie. There wasn't anything unusual. No branches snapping, no animals rustling in the underbrush, just the quiet of the night. But something didn't feel right. I couldn't explain it at first, but it was like an invisible weight had settled on my chest. A sense of awareness crept over me, sharp and instinctual. I stopped walking, my foot poised above the ground, and listened. It was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of the forest had faded, and I could feel a tension in the air. My senses seemed heightened. Every breath I took, every movement I made felt louder, more pronounced. That's when I realized something. Someone, or something, was behind me. I didn't hear anything, not even a footstep or the rustle of leaves. But it was there, just beyond the reach of my awareness. It was like a whisper at the back of my mind, telling me that I wasn't alone. I turned around slowly, scanning the trail behind me. Nothing. The moonlight cut through the trees, casting long shadows across the trail, but there was no sign of anything. No shape, no movement. But I felt it. That feeling of being watched, of being hunted. I can't explain it. It's not like the feeling you get when you think you hear someone walking behind you, or when you turn around and someone's right there. It wasn't like that at all. It was deeper, more primal. It was like the forest itself knew something I didn't. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring down the trail, trying to make sense of it all. My logical mind told me that it was nothing, that it was just the wind, or an animal, or my imagination running wild. But deep down, something in me screamed that it was something more. I don't know how I knew it, but I did. Whatever was behind me knew I knew it was there, and it was toying with me. I took a slow step forward, trying to shake the feeling, but it didn't go away. My instincts were telling me to run, to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't move. It was like I was frozen, caught in the pull of something I couldn't see but knew was there. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound came. It was quick, a swooshing, rushing sound, like the air was being sucked in by something massive. And then, right after it, there was a scraping noise, like a rake sliding across the dirt. The two noises collided, one after the other, and then again and again, 4 times in total. The sounds were so close I could feel them in my bones. They were behind me, just a short distance off, and they were moving fast. I didn't wait to figure out what it was. I turned around and started walking faster, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare run, not yet. I wasn't sure what was following me, but I knew that running would only make it worse. If it was a person, I'd be dead before I could get away. But if I kept moving, if I stayed calm, maybe I could get back to my camp. Maybe I could get to safety. The sounds kept following me, but I didn't turn around. Every few seconds, I could hear them again, rushing air, scraping, as if whatever it was had closed the gap between us. It was a rhythm now, a pattern, almost like it was playing a game with me. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept moving forward, my eyes fixed on the path ahead, the trees blurring as I walked faster and faster. For the next hour, I didn't hear anything other than the sound of my own breath and the pounding of my boots against the earth. I kept moving, not daring to stop, not daring to look over my shoulder. The fight or flight response had kicked in, and there was no turning back. My mind was focused on one thing, getting back to my tent. By the time I reached the clearing near my camp, the oppressive weight I'd been feeling started to lift. The sounds had stopped. The air felt different now, lighter, almost like the tension had been released. I was still on edge, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been pursued for miles. I crawled into my tent, my body trembling from adrenaline, and zipped it up tight. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, I packed up quickly. My camp was already packed, so I just stuffed everything into my bag and hiked out, not looking back. The whole trip felt wrong. I didn't know what had been following me, but I knew that I didn't want to find out. I had no explanation for it. There were no footprints, no signs of anything unusual. It was as though whatever it was had vanished without a trace. When I got back to town, I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't want to sound crazy, and part of me still wasn't sure what had occurred. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe I had just been too focused on the trail. But something in my gut told me that what I experienced was real, and it's something I'll never forget. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I never went back to that trail, and I've never camped in that area again. Some things you just don't question, because no matter how much you try, you can never explain them away. And I've learned to trust that feeling in the pit of my stomach when it tells me something isn't right. Because whatever was out there, that night, I don't think I'll ever fully understand it. And maybe that's the scariest part of all. I spent a lot of Sundays at my grandma's house when I was little, as did my 2 sisters. We'd get there early in the morning, and after breakfast, we'd scatter around. My grandma and her sister lived across the street from each other, so we spent a lot of time between both houses. My grandma's house was small and cozy, but her sister's place was something else. It was an old 3-story house, kind of creaky, but it had a charm to it that you couldn't ignore. The house always felt like there were secrets hidden in it, especially in the basement and the garage, which was where I often found myself. The ladder leading up from the garage was steep, and the whole place always smelled a little musty, like old wood and grease. It wasn't the kind of place most kids would be excited to explore, but I always found a strange comfort in it. The garage had a workroom in the back, which I thought was fascinating with its assortment of tools and old furniture. There was also a small bedroom in the back of the garage, where my great-grandmother lived. She was a quiet, thin woman who had lived there for years. I remember her smile, even though it wasn't one of those huge grins. more like a soft, tired smile that made you feel safe. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her voice was gentle. I always loved spending time with her, though I didn't understand much about her life back then. I was too young to realize that she had her own stories, her own past, and perhaps her own demons. My sisters didn't like going downstairs into the garage. They preferred to stay upstairs in the living room, watching TV, while I wandered down to visit my great-grandmother. I would tell them I was going to play hide and seek with her, and while they rolled their eyes, I'd head down the ladder, always excited to be alone with her in that quiet, old part of the house. We would play, just the two of us, hiding behind the furniture or beneath piles of old blankets. I remember how she would smile and laugh in a soft, raspy way, and I would pretend to search for her, even though I always knew where she was hiding. I felt like I had a special bond with her, a connection that no one else shared. One Sunday, though, everything changed. It was a busy day. All my aunts, uncles, and cousins were there, which meant the house was filled with noise and chaos. I couldn't get a word in edgewise with my sisters, who were glued to the TV, so I decided to go downstairs and see if my great-grandmother was free for a game of hide and seek. I climbed down the steep ladder, as I had done so many times before, and made my way into the garage. The workroom smelled the same as usual, a mix of oil and dust, but it was oddly comforting to me. I took a deep breath and walked to the back of the garage where her bedroom was. I knocked lightly before entering, though I never really needed to knock. The door was always open. There, in the dim light of the room, sat my great-grandmother. She was sitting in her chair by the window, looking out. She didn't seem to notice me at first, so I tiptoed up behind her and whispered, "Grandma, you want to play hide and seek?" She didn't answer right away, but after a moment, she gave me that soft smile. "All right," she said quietly, "but you'll have to find me." And so we played, just like we always did. I'd run off and hide behind an old chest of drawers, and she would count out loud in her low voice. The game was the same every time, and I loved it. There was a peacefulness about it that made the whole house feel safe, like nothing could harm us. At some point, though, my aunt came downstairs to check on me. I didn't know why she asked, but she seemed concerned. She asked me what I was doing in the garage, and I told her I was playing with my great-grandmother. She froze, and I remember that look on her face. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like confusion, like she didn't understand what I was saying. She asked me to show her, so I took her down the narrow hallway into the back bedroom. When we stepped into the room, I pointed to the chair where my great-grandmother had been sitting. The room was still and quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the back corner. But there was no one sitting there. The chair was empty, and for a second, I couldn't understand why. "Where is she?" my aunt asked, her voice shaking a little. "She's hiding," I said, looking around the room, confused. "She's playing hide and seek." My aunt's face turned pale, and her eyes darted around the room, almost frantically. She didn't say anything at first, but when she turned to leave, I followed her. We walked back into the garage, and my aunt's steps were hurried, almost frantic. She seemed like she was trying to hold herself together, but her breath was short, like she was holding back something. "What's wrong?" I asked, but my aunt didn't answer. Instead, she went upstairs to find my mom, and before I knew it, the whole house seemed to freeze. The voices from upstairs grew quiet, and I heard the sound of footsteps rushing through the hall. My mom came down the stairs with a serious expression on her face, and my aunt, still looking shaken, was right behind her. They walked straight to the garage, and my aunt told them what I had said. I remember how everyone in the room stopped talking when they heard what I had said about playing with my great-grandmother. My mom's face changed. She looked at me for a long time, like she was trying to piece something together in her head. But when she spoke, her voice was tight. "That's not possible," she said quietly, though the words seemed forced. "Your great-grandmother, she passed away a long time ago. They told me that she had died shortly after I was born, and that she had hung herself in that very room, in the bathroom just across the hall." My heart dropped. I had no memory of her death, of course. I was too young, but the pieces didn't add up. I remembered the woman I had seen. She looked just like the photos. Her soft, white hair, her gentle smile, and the way she spoke to me, the way she made me feel like I wasn't alone in the world. But my mom's words hit me harder than I expected. It didn't make sense. How could I have been playing with someone who wasn't there? They told me that I must have been imagining it. Maybe I had seen a picture of her, and my mind made up the rest. They told me not to go into the garage alone again, that it wasn't a safe place for a little girl to be by herself. They said it like it was a warning, a rule that I had to follow now. And for a while I did, but I couldn't shake the memory. I kept thinking about my great-grandmother's soft smile, the way she had always played with me, and how she had looked exactly the same as she had in the pictures I'd seen. I couldn't understand it, couldn't explain it. I wanted to believe I had just made it up, but something inside me didn't quite feel right. For weeks after that day, I stayed away from the garage. Every time I walked past the door, I felt a strange shiver run down my spine. It wasn't fear of ghosts or anything like that. It was the feeling that I had missed something, that I hadn't been told the whole truth. My mind kept replaying the image of my great-grandmother, sitting in that chair, smiling softly at me, and I couldn't get it out of my head. Eventually, I stopped thinking about it as much. Life went on, but as I grew older, the memory of that day stuck with me. I would visit my grandma's house again and again, but I never went back to the garage, never went back into that room where the echoes of my great-grandmother's presence seemed to linger. I didn't know the full story until much later, when I was much older, and my mom finally told me what really happened. But by then, I had already accepted that I would never fully understand what had happened that day, or why I had seen her in the garage. It all started about a year ago. The house we moved into was supposed to be a fresh start, a perfect home in a quiet neighborhood. It had an old-world charm, with its creaky floors and dark wooden beams. The walls had a history. I could feel it the moment I stepped inside. But at the time, I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was an older house, after all. Things creaked. Things groaned. The house was bound to settle. I didn't think much of it. But that first night was the beginning of something I never expected, something I could never explain. It was a Thursday, and I had finally gotten my son, Ethan, into bed. He was 7 years old, and he was a light sleeper, always had been. I'd been up late unpacking boxes and organizing the house. By the time I got into bed, I was exhausted. I closed my eyes, and the peaceful quiet of the house filled my ears. But that quiet didn't last. At first, it was just light bangs. Quiet enough that I could convince myself it was nothing, a part of the house settling. But then it kept happening, one after the other, an uneven rhythm. Bang, 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 over and over. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I got up and walked toward the source of the noise. It was coming from Ethan's room. I pushed open the door and found him sitting up in bed, his face pale with fear. He didn't speak at first, just stared wide-eyed at me. I asked him what was wrong, and his voice was barely above a whisper when he said, "Mommy, please make my drawers stop. They keep opening and closing by themselves." I stood there frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what he was saying. But when I turned and looked at his dresser, I could see the drawers were moving, slowly, as if something unseen was pulling them open, then slamming them shut. I rushed to his side, pulling him out of bed and holding him close. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing. I didn't know what to think, what to do. I told myself it was just a malfunction. Maybe the wood had warped or something. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. The rest of that night was a blur. I stayed by Ethan's side, watching the drawers move in and out, unable to stop it. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I tried to chalk it up to exhaustion or stress. But something inside me kept telling me it wasn't over. That night, when I went into the kitchen to warm up a bottle for my newborn Lily, I felt it again. That strange, unsettling feeling. I bent over the table to grab the bottle, and suddenly, crash! A loud, deafening explosion filled the room. I screamed, throwing myself back, my hands shielding my face. Glass rained down from the chandelier above me, shards of it hitting the table, the floor, everything around me. My heart raced, and I felt my hands shaking. I was in a daze, unable to comprehend what had just happened. It didn't make sense. The light bulbs weren't just flickering, they exploded. I looked up, but there was no sign of a short circuit or anything that would explain it. It was as if someone or something had intentionally caused it. I gathered myself together and rushed to the living room where Lily lay sleeping in her bassinet. I picked her up and held her tightly, trying to calm my racing heart. The next night was no better. Ethan was playing with a balloon in the living room. I was sitting on the couch, watching him when it happened. The balloon slipped from his hand, and before I could even react, it floated up into the air, rising higher and higher until it reached the ceiling. But that wasn't the strangest part. It didn't just hover. It moved, pulling itself along as if an invisible hand was guiding it. Ethan screamed. I jumped to my feet, but the balloon didn't stop. It floated through the living room, then turned and headed for the basement stairs. I ran after it, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was chasing or why, but my instincts told me I had to follow it. The balloon went down the basement stairs, then back up, rising toward the attic. I could see the string clearly, the way it tugged as if someone was holding onto it. When I reached the attic, the balloon was just floating there, spinning slowly. I couldn't understand what was happening. The string still pulled, but no one was there. No one was controlling it. I backed away slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The next night, things took a darker turn. At 3 a.m., my phone rang. I groggily answered, wondering who would be calling me at this hour. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Palmer. Her voice was shaky, and I could hear the worry in her words. "Are you okay?" she asked. "You need to check on the kids. There are people surrounding your house." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. There's a dozen or more people. I called the police. They're on their way. "I just want to make sure you're okay," she said, her voice almost frantic. I rushed to the windows, heart in my throat. I could see nothing. Not a single person. Nothing at all. The driveway was empty. The street was still. My mind raced. Why had she called the police? What had she seen? The police arrived shortly after, and I went outside to speak with them. They checked the perimeter, walked around the yard, and found nothing. No signs of anyone being there. No footprints, no car tracks, no signs of intrusion at all. But Mrs. Palmer was convinced. She swore she had seen them. I didn't know what to believe. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The next night, things escalated even further. I was in the kitchen, trying to get a grip on everything, when there was a knock at the door. I opened it, and there stood my other neighbor, Mr. Hall. He looked white as a sheet, his eyes wide with fear. "There's someone in your attic," he said, his voice shaking. "A woman. She keeps staring at me through the window. I saw her, I swear." I froze. "What are you talking about? There's no one in the attic." But when I looked up at the window he was pointing to, I felt my stomach drop. The window he was referring to was on the second floor, in the attic. There was no floor there, no access, just a space between the walls. No one could even reach it. Yet somehow, Mr. Hall was sure he had seen someone. I didn't know what to think anymore. The house was driving me to the edge. But it wasn't until the next morning that everything reached its breaking point. I had been home alone with Lily. I decided to take a shower while she slept in the middle of my bed. I swaddled her tightly, making sure she was secure, then surrounded her with cushions to keep her safe. I knew I would only be gone for a few minutes, so I didn't think anything could go wrong. But when I returned from the shower, I found her moved. She was no longer in the middle of the bed, swaddled and surrounded by cushions. She was near the edge of the bed, dangerously close to falling off. The side pillow that had kept her secure was no longer there. Something, had picked her up, moved her, and placed her in that position. There was no way she could have done it herself. She was too young, too small. The cushions were heavy, the side pillow was large. No newborn could move that. I snapped. I screamed. I was terrified. I didn't care what it was anymore. I wasn't going to stand for it. I stood in the middle of the room, shaking, yelling, demanding whatever was in my house to leave. I didn't care how it happened. I didn't care what was causing it. But I wasn't going to let anything happen to my children. "I have Jesus Christ on my side," I said, my voice firm. "You will leave. Now." I called a priest to bless the house. I did everything I could to get rid of whatever was haunting us. I don't know what worked, but I didn't have another incident after that. But we couldn't stay there. Not after everything that had happened. We moved out as soon as we could. The house sat vacant for months before new owners moved in, but they didn't stay long. A few months later, the house was back on the market. And then it happened again. The next owners, they left too. No one stayed for long. The house has been empty ever since. And I hear the stories from the neighbors. They say something isn't right there. They say it's cursed, haunted, whatever you want to call it. But whatever it is, I'm glad I'm gone. I never want to go back. And I know I'll never forget what happened. The feeling of being watched, of being powerless in my own home. I just thank God that I got out before anything worse happened. It was my freshman year at a small college in the Midwest. I'd moved across the country from the West Coast to a town that felt so different, so quiet, so small. I wasn't used to the way people smiled at you on the street or waved from their porches. The whole place felt peaceful, almost to the point of being eerie. I didn't mind it too much, though. It had its charm, but every once in a while, I'd feel an odd sense of unease. A lot of the time, I found myself visiting my aunt, who lived just on the outskirts of town. Her house wasn't just any house. It was a mansion perched on top of a hill, isolated by thick woods. The closest neighbor was at least half a mile away, and the house itself was huge, with stone walls and dark windows that could seem a little intimidating if you weren't used to the stillness. But I loved it there. My aunt was kind and welcoming, and it was one of the few places where I could feel at home while adjusting to college life. That evening, I'd found myself alone in the house. My aunt was out with some friends, my uncle was away on a business trip, and my cousins were off doing their own thing. I was supposed to be studying for a test, but instead, I ended up on the couch in the living room, flipping through the channels until I found an episode of Cold Case Files. It was one of my guilty pleasures. I had gotten really into true crime and detective shows, particularly anything involving unsolved cases or creepy, twisted situations. It was comforting in some weird way, like I was in control of the chaos, even if it was just on a screen. The house was so quiet that night, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears. There was no wind outside, just a stillness that felt unnatural. I could hear the occasional creak of the wooden floors, or the soft hum of the refrigerator, but everything else was dead silent. That is, until I heard the pounding. At first, I thought it was a car door slamming or maybe a loud thump from the woods behind the house. But then it came again, a quick, angry, frantic banging. It wasn't a knock, like someone casually stopping by. No, it was like someone was slamming their fists into the door repeatedly. Bang, bang, bang. Each hit harder than the last, and I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The noise echoed through the hallway, making my skin prickle with cold. It wasn't the sound of someone just trying to get attention, like a normal knock, or even a knock on the door. This felt different. It was a full-throated, angry kind of pounding, like someone was trying to break through. My stomach twisted into knots. I couldn't think straight. My mind was racing. What the hell was going on? Who was it? Was someone trying to break in? The thought made my chest tighten with panic. I stood up, my body moving on its own. I had no plan, no idea what to do. I ran down the hallway to my aunt's walk-in closet, which was right next to the bathroom. I could hear the pounding growing louder, more frantic, like whoever was out there had gone mad. I pulled open the closet door, my heart hammering in my chest. My hands were shaking, and I could barely get a grip on anything as I grabbed the gun from the top shelf, my aunt's gun. Her family was huge on hunting, and she kept it there for safety, even though she was never home much. I had no idea how to properly handle it, but in that moment, it didn't matter. All I could think about was getting ready for whatever was outside, preparing myself for whatever was about to happen. I could hear the pounding continuing, but it was no longer just on the door. It sounded like it was on the side of the house now, moving around the building, like someone was trying to find a way in. My pulse surged. I didn't know what to do. I stayed low, crouched down, and crawled across the floor to get a better view. I could see the bathroom mirror from where I was, and I positioned myself so that if anyone came through the door, I'd be able to see their reflection first. My mind raced, running through every possible worst-case scenario. I kept whispering to myself over and over, "I'm going to be murdered. I'm going to be murdered. This is it." I dialed my aunt's number first. I don't even remember what I said when I called her. I was too scared, my throat tight and dry. The phone rang and rang, but no one picked up. Then I called my uncle, and after that, one of my cousins. No answer. My pulse was ringing in my ears, my entire body on edge. I could hear my breath catching in my chest, shallow and quick. The pounding outside continued relentlessly, and I could feel my nerves unraveling. My hands were sweating, the gun heavy in my grip. The seconds felt like hours, each one stretching longer and longer. I finally reached my cousin, just as I thought I was going to lose it. He picked up on the third ring, his voice groggy like I'd woken him up. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone confused. I could barely form words. "There's someone outside the house. They're banging on the door. I don't know what to do. I'm scared." My cousin didn't ask many questions. He was used to me being a bit dramatic, but this time, there was no question in my voice. I was terrified. "Okay, don't worry," he said. "I'm going to send one of my friends over to check it out. Stay inside and stay low." I barely heard him hang up before I felt that wave of adrenaline start to wash over me again. The pounding had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It felt too still, too quiet. Every second stretched longer, my heart beat heavy in my chest. 5 minutes passed. 10. My cousin's friend hadn't arrived yet, and the fear that gripped me only grew stronger. The thought that I was alone, completely alone, with no one around for miles, was enough to send me into a state of near hysteria. I was so close to running out of the house myself, to just leave everything behind and get somewhere, anywhere, that felt safe. And then, finally, I heard it. Someone was walking up the driveway. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound that might tell me who it was. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, and they didn't sound panicked. The doorbell rang, followed by a soft knock. My heart stopped. I peeked around the corner, barely daring to breathe. Through the window, I saw the shadow of someone standing outside. The man's face was hidden by the dim light, but I could tell by his stance that he was just waiting. I knew then that it wasn't a break-in. It wasn't a threat. It was just a FedEx driver who had arrived late. I was embarrassed, but mostly relieved. My cousin's friend arrived a minute later, checking the perimeter of the house. He found nothing, just the quiet of the woods and the soft chirping of insects in the distance. It turned out the FedEx guy had been behind schedule, and that was why the delivery had come so late. The banging I'd heard? It was the driver, dropping the package with more force than necessary to knock the wind out of me. The late-night delivery, the unexpected noise. It had all spiraled into a situation that felt more dangerous than it really was. But in that moment, when everything felt real, it was impossible to separate my fear from the reality of what was happening. It wasn't until much later, when my aunt and uncle finally returned home, that I could laugh about it. I didn't really want to, though. That night had left me shaken. There had been something about the way the silence had hung in the air after the pounding, the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have, that had made it all feel like something sinister was lurking just outside the door. I'll never forget how it felt, lying there in the dark, the gun heavy in my hands, waiting for something that never came. It's funny how fear can twist even the most ordinary moments into something unrecognizable. I was a freshman in high school the summer I got accepted into a special academic program held at UC Berkeley. It was supposed to be a big deal, the kind of thing you put on a college application that makes someone stop and say, "Oh, this kid must be serious." I didn't care about impressing anyone, though. I just wanted to get out of my small town and do something that felt bigger than the place I came from. When I got the acceptance email, I felt proud. Nervous too, but mostly proud. The program was set up so students stayed in the dorms on campus. It made us feel like real college kids, even though most of us were still years away from graduating high school. The building I was assigned to was old, not in a crumbling, unsafe way, but in that heavy, worn-down kind of way that makes you feel like a lot of people have passed through before you. Thick doors, weird radiator pipes along the walls, a tiny window that didn't open more than a few inches, and that faint, dusty smell that older buildings seem to hold onto no matter how many times they're cleaned. I shared a room with 2 other girls. We weren't in the same section of the program, so our class schedules were totally different. That meant we were rarely in the room at the same time, especially during the day. I didn't mind that at all. I was shy, used to doing my own thing, and I didn't need to make new best friends or anything. I just needed a place to crash at the end of the day. Our room had a single bed on one side, a bunk bed on the other, and a metal desk stuck in the middle. It didn't leave a lot of space to move around. My stuff barely fit under the bed. I ended up on the top bunk, mostly because I got there last, and that was what was left. The mattress was thin, and every movement made the whole frame squeak and shift, but it was fine. I was used to making do. That night, I came back late. I had gone out to a welcome event that ran longer than I thought it would, and by the time I climbed the 4 flights of stairs up to our room, I was too tired to do anything but crash. I opened the door slowly, trying to be quiet in case anyone was already asleep. The room was pitch black. I didn't want to wake anyone, so I didn't even turn on the overhead light. I just used the flashlight on my phone, aimed low toward the ground. I set my bag down, kicked off my shoes, and climbed into the top bunk as quietly as I could. I didn't bother changing out of my clothes. I just laid down and shut my eyes. It felt like only an hour passed before I woke up to the sound of someone whispering my name. My body was still heavy with sleep, and for a second I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard it again, a soft voice from across the room, calling my name like a question. I rolled over toward the edge of the bed and whispered back, "What?" Still half asleep. Her voice sounded tight, like she was holding back panic. "There's someone in here with us," she said. I saw them come in and go through our stuff. That snapped me awake instantly. My stomach dropped. I didn't understand what she meant. I had just gone to sleep not long ago. Had someone come in after me? I stared into the darkness, trying to see something, anything, but it was too dark. My heart started pounding. I didn't even know where the other roommate was at that point. Maybe still out, maybe asleep in the bottom bunk beneath me. Then the girl across the room started pleading. Her voice cracked, and she said, "Please don't hurt us. Take whatever you want. Just leave us alone. Please, please." Over and over again, whispering but desperate. There was no answer. Just silence. No movement, no reply. Just that eerie stillness that fills the air when something isn't right. I stayed completely still. I was too scared to look off the side of the bed. Every part of me was alert, tense, waiting. I strained to hear something. Footsteps, breathing, a bag being moved. But there was nothing. My roommate kept crying softly and begging. The other girl, the one beneath me, finally stirred. I felt her shift and sit up slowly. Now all three of us were awake, and the fear was thick in the air. I had my phone under my pillow, so I slid it out slowly, trying not to make a sound. I checked for service. Nothing. No bars. Just that stupid little no service message mocking me. I held the phone up, hoping it would catch something, but it stayed dead. The girl below me checked hers. Nothing. We tried to open the browser to look up the campus security number, but the pages wouldn't load. We were stuck. The girl across the room was still whispering, still too afraid to move. I told her she needed to get to our side of the room. If there was someone in here, we had to stick together. She hesitated, then ran. I heard the desk shift slightly as she bumped into it. Then she landed in the bottom bunk beside us. I reached out and grabbed her arm, whispering, "Where is he? Is he in the closet?" She just kept shaking her head. She didn't know. She just knew she saw someone come in. She swore it. The fear was doing something weird to my thoughts. I was scared, yes, but I was also starting to feel angry. Like, what were we going to do? Sit here and hope someone saved us? That didn't feel right. I told the girls I was going to run to the door and turn on the light. If someone was really in here, we outnumbered him 3-1. Maybe we could take him down, or at least scream loud enough for someone else to hear. But the others were frozen, too scared to move. I got ready to go anyway. My legs were shaking, but I couldn't just stay still. I told them I'd run and hold the door open so they could get out. But just as I was about to slide out of the bunk, one of the girls said no. She said if we ran, we'd run together. All of us. We didn't say another word after that. We just counted to 3 in our heads, linked arms, and launched ourselves at the door. I don't even remember unlocking it. We were just suddenly in the hallway, hearts racing, feet pounding on the linoleum as we ran. We didn't stop until we reached the room where the program leaders stayed. We banged on the door until someone opened it. Security was called. They came with flashlights and checked every corner of our room, closet, under the beds, even the vents. They found nothing. No sign of forced entry. No damage. Nothing missing. We were shaking, trying to explain what happened. But the more we said it out loud, the more it started to sound strange. The security guys didn't laugh, but I could tell they didn't believe us. We didn't sleep in that room again. The leaders let us change dorms, no questions asked. I don't think any of us objected. We just packed our things and moved. For the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. I kept trying to replay it in my head, to make it make sense. There was no way someone could have come in and vanished like that. But we had all felt it. That fear was real. It took me a few years to fully piece it together. I don't know exactly when it hit me, but at some point, I realized something important. When I came into the room that night, it had been dark. I'd used my phone's flashlight to move around, but I kept it pointed at the floor. I didn't say anything. I didn't make much noise. I climbed into the top bunk quietly and fell asleep almost immediately. The girl across the room must have assumed I was already in bed when she came in. From her angle, she probably couldn't see the top bunk. So when I showed up and moved around quietly, she thought it was someone else. An intruder. I was the person she saw. I was the one she heard. I was the one she begged to leave. It wasn't until years later that I could laugh about it. For a long time, I really believed we'd almost died. I believed someone had broken in and stood in the dark while we trembled and cried. But there was no one. Just me. Just a stupid misunderstanding and 3 girls letting their imaginations run wild in the middle of the night. But that fear was real. The way my hands shook. The way my heart pounded. The panic in the air. None of that was fake. And even now, thinking back, I can still feel that same tension rising in my chest when I remember that night. It's funny now, sure. But it also reminds me how easy it is for the mind to fill in the blanks with the worst possible thing. How quickly fear can turn into certainty. How one small misunderstanding can snowball into a nightmare. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a murderer. It wasn't anything supernatural or dramatic. It was just me. And that's what makes it scarier in a weird way. Because it means the scariest night of my life wasn't caused by something out of a horror movie. It was caused by silence, shadows, and a misunderstanding. And fear. I grew up in a small, quiet town where it was totally normal for kids to roam around freely. We didn't have cell phones or curfews, and nobody really worried too much as long as we were back before dark. Every day after school, and especially during the long summer breaks, I'd meet up with my best friend, Tyler. We were inseparable. He had this loyal old mutt named Duke, some kind of Labrador mix with a huge head and floppy ears, who followed him everywhere. Duke wasn't just a pet, he was a part of the crew, like our third member. Tyler and I had been working on a secret hideout deep in the woods on the edge of town for a little over 2 years. It started as a small patch of cleared brush behind a fallen log, but over time, we built it up with planks we scavenged from junk piles and nails we stole from our dad's garages. We even had a makeshift roof made from a blue tarp we found on the side of the road. We called it the Spot and spent hours there, carving our names into the trees, building traps that never worked, talking about life, or just lying on the pine needles watching the clouds through the leaves. One late summer afternoon, the air was heavy and warm, the kind of day where the crickets started chirping early and the smell of dry grass hung in the air. We were on our way to the Spot, cutting through a gravel path behind an old hardware store and into the narrow trail that led to the forest line. We had backpacks full of snacks, a hammer, and some rope. Duke trotted ahead, tongue hanging out, tail wagging like usual. We were maybe 100 feet from the forest entrance when we both stopped dead in our tracks. There, just a little up the trail, was this man. He looked like he hadn't bathed in weeks. His clothes were filthy, stained with dirt, and what looked like dried blood or rust, I couldn't tell. His shirt was ripped at the sleeves, and his pants were sagging low. He was Asian, maybe in his 40s or 50s, but his face was hidden behind matted hair and an overgrown beard. He had a long, crooked stick, like a walking staff, which he held in one hand as he shuffled forward barefoot. He didn't notice us at first. He walked a few steps ahead of us, then suddenly squatted down in the middle of the trail. Before we could even register what was happening, he pulled his pants down and started taking a dump right there on the forest edge. We both gasped instinctively, not in disgust, more like in pure shock. That was when he turned his head. His eyes met ours. His face twisted with fury like a dog that had been disturbed mid-meal. He bared his teeth, stood up abruptly, and pulled up his pants without even cleaning himself. He yelled something we couldn't quite make out at first, but then he shouted again louder. His voice was gravelly, angry. We didn't wait to hear the rest. Tyler ran off one way with Duke barking and sprinting beside him, and I instinctively darted straight into the woods, heading for the Spot. My heart was thundering in my ears. I didn't even look back. I could hear branches snapping behind me, whether from the man or just my own footfalls I didn't know. All I could think about was reaching our hideout. I jumped over roots, ducked under branches, nearly twisted my ankle several times, but didn't stop until I got there. The tarp flapped in the breeze slightly. I crawled inside, completely out of breath, my whole body trembling. I waited there, crouched in the dirt, trying to listen for any signs, shouts, footsteps, barking. But it was all quiet except for the insects. I stayed there for what felt like 20 minutes, maybe more. It wasn't until the shaking started to fade that I realized Tyler and Duke hadn't come that way. I slowly got up and stepped out of the Spot. The forest suddenly felt darker, like the sun had dipped just a bit lower while I was inside. I knew Tyler had a favorite place he used to hide when we played games like tag or war, down by a dry creek bed about 5 minutes from the main trail. I walked that way, trying to keep my steps quiet, peering around every tree like the man might jump out from behind one. When I got close to the creek bed, I saw Tyler crouched low behind a tree. His hands were red. No, not just red, soaked. At first I thought he'd cut himself, maybe fallen. I ran over, panicked, asking if he was hurt. He looked at me, not saying a word, just wide-eyed and pale. His shirt was torn, and his breathing was uneven like he'd been running and crying all at once. Duke was nowhere in sight. He just pointed over toward a small thicket maybe 20 feet away. I walked over, carefully, heart thudding in my chest. I didn't want to believe anything bad could have happened to Duke, but as I got closer, I saw the dark patch on the ground. I froze. I wish I hadn't looked, but I did. Duke was lying there, barely recognizable. His fur was soaked through with blood and dirt, one leg twisted at a wrong angle, his eyes half open but blank. His body looked destroyed, like the man hadn't just killed him, but kept hitting him long after. There was blood sprayed on the leaves, on the nearby trunk. Pieces of fur were scattered like dead leaves. It was the most violent thing I had ever seen. I stumbled back, suddenly feeling like I was going to throw up. Tyler hadn't moved from his spot. I realized then that the blood on his hands wasn't his. It was Duke's. He must have tried to stop the man, or tried to hold Duke in his last moments. I didn't ask, not then. He wouldn't have been able to answer anyway. We walked home in silence. Tyler didn't speak. He just stared at the ground, his fists clenched so tight I thought he'd cut his own palms. His house was about 10 minutes from the woods. When we got there, his mom was out front watering her plants. She looked up, confused, and I think her smile faded the second she saw us. I had to explain. Tyler just froze. He didn't say a word. I told her everything as best I could, stumbling over the details, trying not to cry. I left out the really graphic part at first, but she pressed. When I told her about Duke, she dropped the hose and ran inside to call the police. They came fast. A patrol car showed up in about 20 minutes, and then another. They asked me to repeat the story, this time to an officer with a notepad. Tyler sat on the porch swing, knees pulled up to his chest, silent. They sent officers to search the woods, but they didn't find anyone. No stick, no man, not even any sign of a camp or trail. Just Duke's body, which they wrapped up and took away. The guy was never caught. The police said he was probably a vagrant passing through, maybe mentally ill, maybe violent, maybe not, but nobody knew. They checked the local shelters, the train yards, even a few abandoned houses near the outskirts, but he was gone. It was like he'd vanished back into the trees. For weeks afterward, the town was on edge. Parents didn't let their kids out after school, and even during the day, people were more cautious. There were rumors that someone had seen him near the river, or that he had stolen food from a backyard, but none of it was ever confirmed. Eventually the worry faded, as it always does, and the town went back to normal. But we didn't. Tyler didn't go back to the woods after that. Neither did I for a long time. Our spot was abandoned, left to the wind and rain and insects. I visited it once, a year later, just out of curiosity. The tarp had collapsed, and the walls were rotting. The trees had grown a little thicker, as if they were trying to swallow it up. I didn't stay long. It took Tyler years before he could even talk about what happened. He didn't get another dog. His hands were always fidgeting after that, like he needed something to hold on to. He changed in a way I couldn't explain. We stayed friends, but something had shifted. There was a weight in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Sometimes I still think about that day, about how normal it had started, about how fast it all went wrong. And I think about how fragile safety is, how even in a quiet town, in the daylight, with your best friend by your side, things can break apart in a second. We never saw the man again, but I think a part of him stayed with us, in the way that trauma doesn't just fade. It roots itself deep, quiet, and slow, like a seed buried under the forest floor. We grew up, moved away, built new lives. But every time I hear a stick crack in the woods, every time a dog barks sharply in the distance, there's a moment, a single flash, where I'm back on that trail, the trees closing in, running without looking back. I didn't believe in ghosts when I first moved into the dorm. I'd heard the stories, of course, the kind of thing people whisper about when they're half joking and half nervous. like the one about the girl who supposedly disappeared down the hall one night, or the shadowy figure in the corner of the library that no one dared sit near after dark. I was skeptical, rational. There was always a perfectly normal explanation for things, right? But then, things started happening in my room. Small things at first, just little oddities that I could brush off. I chalked them up to the weirdness of dorm life, the fact that I was living in a century-old building, the kind that creaked and groaned with every gust of wind, the kind where the plumbing sounded like it was running underground streams. I shared the room with a girl named Jenna, but she was usually gone on weekends to visit her boyfriend, leaving me alone to deal with whatever oddities my dorm room had in store. It started with my lamp. It was just a cheap bedside lamp, the kind you can get at any discount store, but it was my lamp. It would flicker on and off randomly when there was nothing wrong with it. Sometimes it would blink in a slow, steady rhythm, as if trying to get my attention. I would twist the switch, check the bulb, but it would keep doing it. Once I tried unplugging it and then plugging it back in, but nothing worked. I told myself it was a short or something electrical, nothing to freak out about. But every time it flickered, there was a feeling behind it that made me uneasy, like something unseen was watching, waiting. Then there were the things on my desk. My notebook would slide across the surface when I wasn't touching it, or my pens would shift out of place, moving just enough that I'd notice. I'd turn around and see them, a little askew, but nothing ever felt outright malicious. Just off. I figured I was probably just distracted or absent-minded. I had a lot going on, college life was busy, and I was barely managing everything, much less noticing if I accidentally nudged my things around. But one afternoon, something happened that I couldn't explain away. Jenna was gone, visiting her boyfriend, and I was left alone in the room, too tired to do much of anything. I had just finished a long day of classes, my brain fried from back-to-back lectures, and I decided to take a nap. My bed was raised off the ground, just high enough that I could stow a few boxes underneath it, and I climbed in, pulling the covers up to my chin. I must have drifted off right away, as I barely remember shutting my eyes. I dreamt. It wasn't a pleasant dream. In fact, I don't think I can even call it a dream so much as a nightmare. The thing in my dream was tall and black, so black it seemed to suck the light out of the room around it. A figure, completely featureless except for its glowing white eyes and jagged teeth. It was wearing something like a robe, but I couldn't tell what exactly it was. It didn't matter. All that mattered was that it had a staff, a dark, gnarled thing that it carried like a weapon. I felt its presence before I saw it, like it was always there, just out of sight. And the worst part, it was following me. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, I couldn't escape it. Every time I turned a corner or went through a door, it was there, watching, grinning. I remember the dread that crawled over me, sinking deep into my chest as I tried to keep moving. And then I said it, almost to myself. "Oh, it's you." It wasn't a surprise. It was like I had known this thing had been with me for years, even though I'd never seen it before. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had always been there, hiding in the dark corners of my life, waiting. It was taunting me, waiting for me to realize that it had been following me, waiting for me to acknowledge its existence. And then I woke up. I was still in my bed, still under the covers, but something was wrong. It felt off. I couldn't place it at first, but then I saw it. The black figure from my dream, standing at the edge of my raised bed. It was real. I could see the thing grinning down at me with those same glowing eyes. My heart started hammering in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that it was just some residual nightmare, just some trick of my exhausted brain. But when I opened them again, it was closer, much closer. It was on top of me now, pressing down on me, its cold breath chilling my skin. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It felt like the weight of it was crushing me, like I was suffocating under its presence. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I couldn't. Time stretched on forever, the seconds dragging by like hours. I could feel the grip of panic tightening around me, my chest burning as I gasped for air. But the thing didn't let up. Its grin widened, and I knew in that moment that it was toying with me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to shift. It was as if some invisible pressure lifted, just enough for me to sit up. My heart was racing, and I could feel the sweat clinging to my skin. I swung my legs out of bed, my hands trembling as I reached for the bedside lamp, desperate to turn it on. I fumbled with the switch, and when the light flickered on, I breathed a sigh of relief. But then the light went out. The lamp clicked off, plunging me back into darkness. My heart skipped a beat, my hands shaking harder now. I turned the lamp back on, but it immediately clicked off again. It was like a cruel joke, one that I wasn't laughing at. My throat constricted, panic setting in as I desperately tried to turn the light on, only for it to keep cutting out. "No, please," I begged, the words slipping from my mouth before I even realized what I was saying. "Please not again. Please just stay on." But the lamp stayed off. My voice was a desperate whisper, pleading into the empty room. It was like the thing in the dream, no, in the room, was toying with me, waiting for me to snap. I had to get out. I couldn't stay there another second. I jumped up from the bed, nearly tripping over my own feet as I bolted for the door. My legs were shaky, my chest tight with fear, but I made it out into the hall, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was in my sweet mate's room, panting, half hysterical. She looked up from her desk, her eyes wide with confusion as I blurted out what had happened. She didn't question me, though. She just listened, nodding with understanding, and when I was done, she handed me a small Buddha figure. She said it was to protect me, though I didn't really believe in that kind of thing. The next day, when I was finally starting to calm down, my other sweet mate came to me. She looked pale, like she had seen a ghost herself. She told me that while I was napping, she'd been in her room, door open, when she saw something, a shadow, standing in the hall. It wasn't like any shadow she'd ever seen before, she said. It was like a man, tall and dark, just standing there, staring at her. Then it turned and walked toward my room, its footsteps heavy on the floor. She had no idea what was going on in my room at that exact moment, but she said the timing was too perfect. And just like that, I knew. It wasn't just me. It was something else, something that had been in that dorm for longer than I had been, something that had followed me, something that had watched me from the shadows and now, finally, decided to make its presence known. I didn't stay in that room much longer after that. I moved out to another dorm on the other side of campus, but the feeling never really left me. I still keep that little Buddha figure next to my bed. Every time I look at it, I wonder if it really helped, or if it was just my way of holding onto something that made me feel safe. I don't know what it was in that room, what followed me, or why it seemed to pick me, but I learned that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are real, and sometimes the only thing you can do is run. I grew up hearing strange stories about the pub my grandparents used to own. They lived in the house that was attached to it, right above the bar, where the heavy scent of wood polish and stale beer would seep into every room. The pub had always been a place of comfort for my grandparents, my granddad running the bar, greeting the regulars, and my grandmother managing the household and looking after the kids. But over the years, the stories of strange happenings surrounding the house became impossible to ignore. My grandmother, in particular, swore up and down that the house was haunted, and I couldn't help but wonder if the things she talked about were real, or if she was just looking for a reason to explain the odd things that happened there. One night, when I was young, I stayed at their house for the weekend. It was a Friday, and as usual, my grandparents were busy with their routines. My grandmother, always the early riser, had prepared a big dinner for everyone before settling down for the evening. The kids were already tucked in, including my younger uncle, and my granddad was still in the pub, finishing his work and waiting for closing time. My grandmother had a habit of turning in early, usually before the rest of the house went to bed, so that night was no different. She tucked us all in and went to sleep herself, but I could tell there was something slightly off about her. Her eyes were tired, and she seemed to have a distant look on her face, but it wasn't unusual for her to be exhausted after a long day of tending to the house, the kids, and the pub. I remember waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of clattering coming from the kitchen downstairs. It was odd because the house was normally so quiet after hours, the only sounds coming from the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant hum of the bar's refrigeration. But this time, it sounded like dishes were being moved around, cups, plates, maybe silverware. It startled me at first, but I figured it was just my granddad cleaning up after closing, or maybe he was fixing a late-night snack. I rolled over and tried to fall back to sleep, brushing it off. The next morning, when everyone was awake, my grandmother asked my granddad what he had been doing in the kitchen the night before. Her voice was soft, as though it was just a casual question, but I could see a hint of concern in her eyes. "What were you doing down there so late, making all that noise?" she asked, clearly confused by the sounds she had heard. But my granddad just stared at her, his face scrunching up in confusion. "I wasn't in the kitchen last night," he said, a little chuckle escaping his lips. "I went straight to bed after closing. You must have heard something else." My grandmother was quiet for a moment, but she didn't push it any further. The conversation ended, but something lingered in the air. My grandmother's uneasy expression told me that she wasn't convinced. I could tell it had bothered her more than she let on. A few weeks later, my uncle, who was just a young child at the time, added to the strange occurrences. He had been playing upstairs in the house when he suddenly came running down to my grandparents, looking frightened. He said he had seen someone standing at the top of the stairs, someone he didn't recognize. He was just a kid, and at first, my grandparents thought it was a figment of his imagination. Children's stories often blur the lines between reality and fantasy, after all. But when my uncle insisted, they started to get concerned. My grandparents tried to reassure him, but the next few nights, my uncle wouldn't sleep in his room alone. He would come downstairs, scared, and sit with my grandmother in the living room. He wasn't one to make up stories, so my grandparents started wondering if there was more to it than just childhood fear. As time went on, strange things kept happening, and no one could explain them away. There were sounds, distant thuds, the feeling of someone brushing past you when no one was there. People reported strange cold spots in the house, and some of the regulars at the pub mentioned feeling uneasy when they walked through the door. There were moments when the lights would flicker for no reason, or the doors would open and close on their own. It was the kind of stuff that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, but nothing you could ever quite put your finger on. Years later, after my grandparents had sold the pub, my mom went back to visit the house for the first time in years. It had been sold to a new bar owner, but there was a strange atmosphere about the place when she walked in. She had heard from the locals that no one ever stayed in the house for long. The pub had been passed from owner to owner, and the house was always part of the deal, but each new owner seemed to get nervous and eventually sell it. When my mom spoke to the current owner of the bar, she was surprised to hear that the staff were so uncomfortable in the building that none of them stayed after dark. The owner herself had refused to live in the house attached to the pub, citing how creepy it felt. It was the kind of place where you couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching you, even when no one was around. The bar was busy, and the business was thriving, but the house? It was a different story. People who worked there said they felt strange, like there was always someone behind them, or something just out of sight. I listened to my mom talk about the place, and even though I didn't know the details of every story, I could feel the weight of it all. It was like the house had a personality of its own, one that made everyone uneasy. No one stayed there long, and no one felt comfortable living in the house. Even the bar staff were scared. It wasn't the kind of thing you could explain, but it was something that everyone who had been there seemed to understand. The house had its own strange energy, one that couldn't be shaken off. It's been years now since that visit, but I haven't forgotten the way my mom described the place. Even though no one ever claimed to have seen anything that would make you believe in ghosts or anything like that, the feeling in the house was unmistakable. I've been back to the pub myself a few times, and I can't say I felt the same way my mom did. But when I walk past the old house, I can't help but feel like it's watching me. It's an unsettling feeling that sticks with you, no matter how hard you try to ignore it. My grandparents moved out of that house years ago, and I don't think anyone has lived there since. The last time I passed by, I noticed a for sale sign in the yard, and it made me wonder if the place would ever be bought again. I don't think anyone who has ever lived there has lasted more than a year. I've heard people say the house has a way of driving people away, but I don't know if that's just a rumor. What I do know is that when I pass the pub now, there's a strange feeling in the air, a sense of unease that lingers. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me, but I can't help but wonder if the house was really haunted, or if there was something else going on that we could never quite explain. It's a mystery that may never have an answer, and maybe that's for the best. Some things are better left unsolved. I was about 8 years old when my family took a trip to California. We were exploring the gold country, and one of our stops was Columbia, a preserved gold rush town. My parents had booked us a night at the Columbia City Hotel. I remember the building was old, with creaky wooden floors and antique furniture. It felt like stepping back in time. The hotel was part of the Columbia State Historic Park, and the whole town had this preserved 19th century vibe. I was more interested in the old-timey candy store and the stagecoach rides than the history, but my parents were into it. When we arrived, my parents were checking in at the front desk, and I wandered around the lobby. There was a group nearby, maybe a tour, and I caught snippets of their conversation. They were talking about ghost stories associated with the hotel, mentioning miners and gold prospectors. I didn't pay much attention. I was more focused on the candy I had just gotten. That night, we settled into our room. It was furnished with antique pieces, and the bed was large and ornate. I remember the wallpaper had a floral pattern, and there was a faint smell of old wood and something floral, maybe from the furniture polish. My parents were on one side of the room, and I had a small bed near the window. I fell asleep quickly, but sometime in the early morning, I woke up crying from a nightmare. I was still half asleep, disoriented, and my heart was racing. As I lay there, trying to calm down, I heard a soft humming. It was a woman's voice, gentle and soothing, like a lullaby. It reminded me of how my mom would hum to me when I was upset. But I realized my parents were asleep on the other side of the room, and the humming was coming from near my bed. I wasn't scared, the humming was comforting. Then I heard a soft voice say, "Shush, go back to sleep, baby." It was so gentle and calming that I did just that. I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I remembered the humming and the voice. I thought it must have been a dream, maybe my imagination. But as we were leaving the hotel, I heard another tour group talking about the hotel's history. They mentioned a woman who had stayed in the hotel during the gold rush era. She had lost her child in infancy while staying in the room we had just occupied. They said people still reported hearing her singing lullabies and the cries of a baby. I hadn't heard that part of the story before, and it sent a chill down my spine. It made me question whether what I experienced was just a dream. Even now, years later, I remember that night vividly. It was a moment that made me believe that sometimes the past lingers in unexpected ways. When I graduated college, I was eager to start the next chapter of my life. The problem was I didn't have a clear plan, and that made me feel lost for a little while. I decided the best thing to do was get a job to keep me busy, make some money, and figure things out as I went along. So, when I found an opening for a morning cleaner at the local movie theater, I took it. The hours were strange, 4 a.m. to 10 a.m., but I didn't mind. It would leave me plenty of time during the day to pursue other things. I figured it was a simple enough job. The interview was with a guy named Jeff. He was scruffy, with a day's worth of stubble and messy hair, wearing an old band t-shirt and jeans that had seen better days. He looked like he had been working the night shift. I remember he asked me all the typical questions. If I was okay with working odd hours, cleaning up after people, dealing with gross stuff like vomit and spilled drinks. Then, at the end, he asked something that stuck with me. "Do you scare easy?" he asked, looking me straight in the eye. I was caught off guard. I laughed it off and said, "No, not at all." He nodded and gave me a strange, almost knowing smile. The job itself wasn't bad. Most of it was standard cleaning duties, sweeping popcorn out of theaters, scrubbing the occasional sticky spot off the floor, taking out trash. Nothing too crazy. Since the theaters weren't open yet, I usually had the whole place to myself. The layout of the theater was huge, shaped like a T. The lobby and bathrooms were in the stem, and the theaters were spread out in two long wings, with the smaller ones on the left and the bigger IMAX theaters on the right. Above the theaters was a long hallway with the projection room and a few small offices, where all the projector equipment was stored. My main responsibility, when I was the first to arrive, was to go upstairs and turn on the lights in the theaters. It wasn't hard work, but it could be a little unsettling, especially when the building was still dark and quiet. The lights flickering to life felt like they belonged to a different world, one where things were too still, too quiet. Jeff had mentioned once that the place could be a little creepy when it was dark. He wasn't wrong. In the projection room, there were walls full of old movie posters and promotional material. But what made it unsettling were the countless cardboard cutouts of characters from old movies, their lifeless eyes staring at you as you passed through the hall. At night, when the lights were off, it looked like a sea of people watching you. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as time passed, I noticed something strange happening. There was one theater in particular, Theater 5, that everyone avoided. It was tucked away at the far end of the hall, behind the bathrooms, and to get to the seating area, you had to walk down a long, dim hallway. Most people hated cleaning that theater, but I didn't understand why at first. It wasn't any dirtier than the others, and it was just another part of the job. But there was something about it that felt off. The air always felt heavy in there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. People talked about strange headaches and nosebleeds they'd gotten while cleaning it. Others complained about feeling like they were being followed. One morning, while I was sweeping up trash in Theater 5, I heard footsteps. They were quick, like someone running. I froze, turning my head towards the back of the theater. I could just make out the shape of a little blonde-haired boy turning the corner into the long hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I dropped my broom and bolted after him. I was sure I had seen him clearly, but when I got to the hallway, there was no sign of the kid. I ran further into the lobby and spotted Jeff outside, smoking a cigarette. "Who was that kid?" I asked out of breath. Jeff turned to me, confused for a moment, and then laughed. "Oh, you met Charlie, huh?" Charlie, I learned, was another oddity at the theater. He was a little blonde-haired boy that customers occasionally complained about. People said they'd see him running up and down the aisles of Theater 5 during a movie, making noise and causing a ruckus. When they'd try to catch him, he'd always disappear. The staff had given him the nickname Charlie, after the boy from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, since he looked just like him. Over time, it became clear that Charlie was something more than just a mischievous child. He would knock over trash cans, move things around, and make it harder for us to keep the theaters clean. Some people thought he was the ghost of a lost child, but no one could explain where he came from. At that point, Jeff admitted that some people have seen and heard things at the theater, which was his roundabout way of telling me the place was haunted. I didn't know what to make of it. The theater was relatively new, having been built in the 90s on land that had once been wetlands. I'd heard rumors that the land had once been owned by a family that sold it off in the 80s, but there was no solid evidence of anything particularly strange about it. No history of tragedy or violence. It was just an odd place, with strange happenings that no one could quite explain. One day, Jeff asked me to take a couple of bags of trash to the basement. The basement was where they stored extra supplies and old movie props, but I had never been down there before. Jeff pointed down the hall and told me it was the last door on the left. "Don't go down there by yourself," he warned me. "There's a lot of stuff down there. You might trip over something." I was by myself that morning. Trevor, another worker, was on the other side of the building, blowing out popcorn. I didn't want to walk all the way over to grab him, so I decided to handle it myself. I opened the door to the basement and saw a steep staircase that descended into darkness. I turned on the light switch to my left, but the light at the bottom of the stairs flickered, casting eerie shadows. Just then, I heard the door to the lobby open behind me. I turned, but Jeff hadn't come back inside yet. I figured I was just hearing things. I looked back down the stairs and was about to head down when I heard a voice from the bottom. It was a low, raspy sound. "Hey," the voice said. "Hey, Seymour." My blood ran cold. I froze on the spot. I wasn't imagining it. The voice called again, louder this time. "You gotta see this. Come here and look." There was a shadow creeping up the stairs, just barely visible in the dim light. I could see it move closer, coming up the stairs toward me. My heart hammered in my chest, and every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. Without thinking, I threw the trash bags down the stairs, turned off the light, and bolted back down the hallway to the lobby. Jeff had just come back inside. I tried to tell him what had happened, but he didn't seem concerned at all. In fact, he sounded almost irritated when I told him I was going down there alone. "Nothing here is going to hurt you," he said dismissively. It was almost as if he'd heard it all before and didn't think it was a big deal. Later that day, I told Trevor what had happened. He seemed skeptical, but when we went back to the basement to check it out, the trash bags I'd thrown down the stairs were gone. There was no sign of them anywhere. I didn't know what to make of it, but I wasn't going down there again. The projector room, however, was another story. Every morning, Jeff and Trevor would go to McDonald's for breakfast while I stayed behind. I would lay on the floor of the long hallway, listening to my iPod, trying to drown out the sounds that came from the projection room. No matter how loud I turned up the volume, I could never block out the sounds of footsteps, heavy pounding footsteps, like someone sprinting back and forth in the projection area. The sounds echoed down the hallway, so loud I could almost feel them in my chest. When I told Jeff about it once, he just shrugged it off. "It's just the building settling," he said. "There's a lot of equipment upstairs making noise." but it never felt like the building was just settling. The footsteps were too deliberate, too rhythmic. And sometimes I would hear voices, faint whispers coming from somewhere in the projector room or from Theater 5. I couldn't make out the words, but it always felt like someone was talking, just out of reach. Then, one morning, I had my encounter with the tall man. It was early, the first to arrive that day, and I was assigned to go upstairs and turn on the theater lights. I was dragging my feet that morning. I hadn't slept much the night before. I was looking for my flashlight, but couldn't find it anywhere. We would usually keep it by the door, but it was missing. I didn't want to bother Jeff and Trevor, so I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight on that. I walked through the dark hallway, flipping the switches as I went, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of dread that was settling over me. I was whistling the theme song to the Andy Griffith Show to keep myself calm when I saw it. A cardboard cutout, one of the movie posters, standing a few yards away in the projection area. I thought nothing of it at first. The hall was full of these cutouts, some standing and some leaning against the walls. But then, the cutout moved. I froze. My heart stopped. The figure was hunched over, its head tilting as it seemed to mimic my whistling. Slowly, it straightened up. It was tall, at least 7 feet tall, and as it rose from its crouch, I could see the shape of a man in a dark suit. He had a bowler hat, just like the descriptions of the tall man I had heard. The figure began to move toward me, its footsteps slow and deliberate. I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the floor, and my breath caught in my throat. The tall man was coming closer, whistling the same tune I had been whistling just seconds ago. His gait was strange, almost like he was limping, dragging his left leg as he walked. I stood there, unable to do anything as he drew closer. But then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and walked into one of the offices down the hall. My legs finally obeyed me, and I ran out of there as fast as I could. I didn't care anymore about the lights or the switches. I just wanted out of that hallway. The next day, I handed in my 2 weeks' notice and never went back. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that place,